Bang! In the void, a figure descended from the ether. It was Muyin Lan. He landed directly next to Muyin Shu. At the same time, Blind Tai also returned behind Yi Futian. In their battle, Muyin Lan realized that he couldn't overpower Blind Tai. After returning to the village as a blind man, he seemed even stronger than before, be it in perception, attack, or reaction speed. He couldn't see with his eyes, but he was more terrifying than when he could see. Muyin Lan lowered his head to look at Muyin Shu, who was beside him. His eyes were icy and gloomy. He left when Muyin Shu was still very young, so he almost had never seen him since. He and his younger brother communicated entirely through transmissions. As the absent elder brother, he thought he had not done much for him, so he doted on him and indulged his whims. But at this moment, Muyin Shu was being treated thusly. Older brother. Muyin Shu's eyes were glowing with blood as he regarded Muyin Lan. Those eyes made Muyin Lan feel enraged. Nahai Qianxue also stopped fighting immediately, and came to his side. Seeing Muyin Lan's expression, she knew just how badly he was feeling at this moment. Get up! Muyin Lan helped Muyin Shu up, then handed him over to the care of the Nahai family. He raised his head to look at Yi Futian, his eyes filled with terrible murderous intent, not just toward Yi Futian, but to all the cultivators from Four Corner Village. This was not the case before, because after all, he was a cultivator from the village. Even if Four Corner Village did not want him and he lost in the fight, he still cared about their history together. However, his own feelings aside, the people in Four Corner Village did not seem to care about the past as much as he did. Everyone was following Yi Futian's lead and even abused his brother. In his eyes, Muyin Shu was nothing more than a teenager. He looked at Yi Futian, Blind Tai, and the others. He said, "From today onward I, Muyin Lan, am done with Four Corner Village." Blind Tai, Fang Huan, and the others were moved slightly when they heard his words, but they did not have too much emotion. The Muyin family was expelled from Four Corner Village because of their own doings. The Muyin family was too ambitious and wanted to take control of the village and even entertained the possibility of joining forces with the Nahai family, which was tantamount to betrayal. Muyin Shu was more akin to a jackal. Perhaps the people in Four Corner Village didn't resent Muyin Lan so much. But as for Muyin Shu, even people like Blind Tai wanted him dead. This little beast was not worth calling a human being. Therefore, the positions of both sides were destined. They could ever only stand on the opposite side as enemies. Buzz! An extremely radiant golden divine glory flashed and was gone. A shadow of a golden-winged rock appeared in the void, rushing directly at Yi Futian. At this moment, Yi Futian sensed that a terrifyingly sharp aura covered him. Be careful! Blind Tai's reaction was incredibly fast, and he appeared in front of Yi Futian in an instant. He raised his hand, and a hammer strike came down. The gigantic divine hammer and the terrifying incoming golden-winged rock converged. With a loud bang, the body of the golden-winged rock shattered, but a gust of wind was set off between heaven and earth. Muyin Lan did not continue to attack. He knew that they had lost in this confrontation. Although there were still those in the Nahai family who had not taken action, it was of little use. Apart from him and Nahai Qianxue, no one else could decide the outcome of the battle. What was more, the Renhuang of the Duan family had been watching from the sidelines. If they fought desperately at all costs, Muyin Shu and the others could not afford such a price either. Therefore, his gaze swept toward Yi Futian. There was an undisguised murderous intent in his eyes. But he turned around, walked towards the direction of the relic in front of him, and said, "You guys stay and take care of little Shu. The others will come with me." After that, he went straight inside. He knew that Yi Futian and the others would not touch Muyin Shu anymore. If they had wanted to kill him, they would have done it before. Yi Futian didn't dare. Many people were watching all this taking place. They didn't expect that the cultivators of the Nahai family would be at a disadvantage, suppressed by Yi Futian. They asked for a truce, and Muyin Shu was brutally humiliated. If it weren't for Yi Futian's concern about Nahai family, they probably would have already killed Muyin Shu on the spot. It would seem that this enchanting young talent still had a long way to go, and had no capital to be as unruly as he had been. "Let's go take a look, too." Duan Qiong walked up and said in a low voice. Yi Futian nodded and headed inside as well. Previously, a beam of light had sailed across the firmament from the relic and was seen from far away. It would indicate that something had been discovered, possibly relics that had not been plundered. Now that the turmoil here had been settled temporarily, they ought to check it out. The cultivators from Nahai family and Muyun Lan had also entered, and they must have discovered something. Moreover, there were many other cultivators in the relic, and none of them had not come out yet. Yi Futian and the others walked directly into the relic and felt that they had stepped into the ruins of a magnificent ancient city. Many dilapidated buildings were thousands of meters high and awe-inspiring. There must have been many splendid and ancient buildings in their heyday, but now they lay in ruins. As they continued walking forward, an invisible coercion gradually spread out in front of them. Before they got any closer, they could feel its transcendent power. Yi Futian revealed a trace of surprise. The relic had been plundered throughout generations and should have already been depleted by all the lootings. All that could be taken had already been taken away. Now, after so many years, could there still be opportunities of the Great Path? If so, why hadn't it been discovered before? Yi Futian didn't think too much. They sensed the aura as they continued moving forward. It didn't take long for them to feel that they had entered the world of another space, as if a wave of invisible power swept toward them. "Be careful. This force is powerful." Blind Tai couldn't see the situation outside clearly, so he reminded Yi Futian as the situation here seemed a bit complicated. Yi Futian nodded. He had felt this power seem to become stronger as they moved further along until Yi Futian and the others came to the place where the dazzling divine light originated. They stopped and watched the scene ahead in shock. Not just them, but many people in this area had no time to even pay attention to the violent battles taking place outside, loitering in this space instead. In the front, what seemed to be the central area of the relic, there were 4 incredibly massive stone pillars surrounded the area. These 4 stone pillars were hefty and were far apart, surrounding a particular area. Terrifying brilliance dazzled in that area, and the 4 stone pillars were also bursting with dazzling light. "This is an independent space," Yi Futian murmured. "Yes, a small world. It is self-contained," Blind Tai said. Besides the Nahai family, there were other cultivators from other major principalities. All of them were focusing their attention to the front, their expressions solemn, waiting with their guard up. Not long ago, someone tried to rush in by force and was slaughtered without a trace. The Tsangyuan continent was plundered long ago. "Why are there any relics appearing now?" said Duan Qiong from the ancient royal family of Duan. He looked at the people around them and thought that these people should know how this relic appeared. Because a word was solved. At this moment, someone raised his head and spoke to Duan Qiong, who was in the void. "Solved a word?" Yi Futian looked at the speaker. "Yes, one word." The man nodded and continued. "One word contained an entire world. All these wonders are here because of the emergence of one word that materialized what we see before us now." Yi Futian felt unsettled when he heard the man's words. On the way over, he had heard from Duan Qiong, and the others talked about how terrifying the former master of Tsangyuan continent was. Now, he was hearing that the wonderment in front of them was nothing but a word. Previously, someone had discovered the word boundary in the ruins of the relic. After trying to communicate with it, the ancient word was cracked. Then, when the word disappeared, what is in front of us appeared. This world was hidden in the word boundary. A world hidden in one word. Yi Futian's heart was quite stricken with this knowledge. Chapter 2156 Walked right through. Yi Futian and the other martial artists looked ahead. Within the 4 pillars that surrounded that space, they could roughly make out a magnificent sight. It was like an incomparably luxurious ancient palace, and it looked majestic. The word, world, sealed a little world within it, and this little world was very likely to have something to do with the previous owner of this place, or it could even have been left behind by the previous owner back then. Yi Futian wasn't the only one who thought this way, everyone else thought the same way too. However, the 4 pillars that had seemingly formed a terrifying seal around the little world had made it impossible for all the cultivators to step in. Otherwise, all of them wouldn't have been waiting here for so long and would have gone in a long time ago. Woom! A Renhuang who came later tried, and an illusionary shadow created by divine consciousness flew straight towards the pillars of light in front. But once it came close to the pillars of light, it began to bend, and after it entered the area surrounded by the pillars, the shadow created by divine consciousness was bent so badly that it shattered. The shadow ceased to exist, which made that Renhuang let out a muffled cry, and he looked a little embarrassed. The great path here is not compatible with ours. If we try to enter by force, we will be destroyed, and our spiritual souls will also fall apart and turn to dust. We can't go at all, that Renhuang said in a slightly low voice. For many years, nobody had discovered anything on this continent, but their trip this time gave them a pleasant surprise. They had found this hidden little world, which could be hiding a huge secret. It might have even been left behind by the deities who once occupied this place. But now, they were all blocked from entering it, and none of them liked this feeling of being stuck outside very much. Futian's gaze became extremely frightening and deepened greatly as he looked fixedly in front. He noticed that the space surrounded by the pillars was completely different from the world outside the pillars. It was as if this space was a void. If it didn't have a barrier around it that forbade anyone from entering it, most people probably couldn't even see that this space existed. This made his heart suddenly start palpitating because he had discovered an extraordinary phenomenon. The way this space existed was very similar to a place he had been to before. Four Corner Village! Back then, the space occupied by Four Corner Village was also impossible for ordinary people to see since it was an illusionary space. Only certain people on the day of sacrificial rites were able to see it and enter it. These people were all people with great fates, and to Futian, this so-called fate was really an ability to perceive. It was one's ability to perceive the path that was incompatible with this world. Such a discovery made Futian recall many things. It seemed as though the legendary people of the past lived in a different world from the world he lived in today. That year, the heavenly path collapsed, and the world went through a major change, and that's how there was now a difference between this world and the original realm. Was there a link between the relics that the ones before him had left behind and the original realm? But of course, the real reason why Futian's heart was palpitating was not any of these. It was his spirit. This spirit was a world tree, so it was able to develop a connection with divine items from the past, and it could even help him absorb from the land of demons and swallow the hearts of demons. This enabled him to overlap the two spaces of the Four Corner Village, which made it truly frightening. But what did all of this really mean? What exactly was a world tree? Was it really just a spirit that had been passed on? After cultivating to his current level, the things that Futian understood could no longer be compared to what he understood in the past. Cultivators who had reached the Renhuang level could already remodel and change their own spirits. As their cultivation level increased, they could make their own divine wheel of the Great Path go through a complete transformation, which, in turn, influenced and changed their spirit. As it continued to evolve and be passed on, a real divine item could change one's fate against heaven's will, and so, it was only natural that the spirit could also be changed. He couldn't help but wonder if this world tree spirit was as simple as what he had inherited. It seemed like yet another opportunity to confirm his own spirit. This space here is a space of the great path that a legendary character of the past has left behind, and it is incompatible with the great path of space we have right now. This little world could be said to be a different world. Just then, someone spoke up as if he had also sensed something special about this space. The person who had spoken was Lan. He was a cultivator who had come from Four Corner Village and seemed to be more sensitive towards the aspect of cultivation. Also, his own cultivation level was very high, so he could sense that this space was different from the ordinary. This world here doesn't want outsiders to enter, so it has become a twisted and destructive space. So if one barges in by force, one would enter into a twisted great path of space, said Nehai Chinshire as she looked at Lan. That's right. Muyin Lan nodded. If one can get in by force and can withstand this amount of force, then there's a chance you can go in. The other possibility is that those gifted in the cultivation of perfect grade great path of space might be compatible and enter this space. Perhaps I could give it a try, said Muyin Lan. His expression was grim as his eyes were fixed ahead. Nahai Chinchua looked at him and said in a low voice, "It's too risky for you to do that." This was merely Muyin Lan's conjecture, and even though Muyin Lan's great path was perfect and could be compatible with the power from that space's great path, the space before them was left behind by someone great in the past. It would have reached the pinnacle of cultivation. So there was still a difference between the two. If Muyin Lan barged in like that, it would be very dangerous. Before this, I didn't try because I wanted to see it more clearly. But I think I'm quite sure now, and I'm 80% confident of this. Even if I fail, I don't think I'd be trapped either, given my level of cultivation, said Muyin Lan. He was determined to try barging in. Nahai Chinchua knew Muyin Lan's temperament, and knew he was an extremely proud man. Since he wanted to try, then she wasn't going to be able to stop him. Be careful, said Nahai Chinchua. Don't worry. Muyin Lan nodded. After that, the divine light on his body glowed brilliantly as he unleashed the power of the great path of space to its maximum. His entire body was glowing with the divine light, and the golden rock wings behind him spread out as if it was able to break through the void at any time. If there were any sign that he might be trapped, he would give up immediately. The others all turned towards Muyin Lan. This man was indeed a legendary character of their era, and his boldness and resolution were much higher than a normal person's. He actually wanted to barge in by force. They watched as Muyin Lan walked towards the space surrounded by the pillars, flapped his wings, and entered the space. At that moment, they saw countless streams of lights flashing in the space as it enveloped his body. The rest of them watched Muyin Lan with much anxiety. Would he be successful? The family members of the Nahai family were the most anxious, especially Nahai Chinchua. They saw that Muyin Lan had run into some trouble inside, but he was still making progress. He seemed to have entered that space's dimension, and all the cultivators watching were surprised that they couldn't sense him anymore. His speed had slowed down as he moved along cautiously. Muyin Lan seemed to be walking extremely slowly. Even though there was no sign of any great battle happening, many still felt like their hearts were in their mouth. Just then, they saw Muyin Lan suddenly increase in speed as he rushed in like a bolt of lightning. In the next moment, his body had entered the world surrounded by the pillars. Muyin Lan's body seemed to become especially small as he stood inside. It was as if the measurement standards of the world inside were different from the world outside. In that case, even though this space didn't look very large from the outside, it might actually be huge once one got in. He's gone in. Many of them felt their hearts tremble. Muyin Lan had been able to go in, but it was hard for the rest of them to do so. It was already rare to find a perfect grade great path cultivator in the first place, and someone who had perfected the great path of space was even rarer. Even the top factions of power might not find many among themselves. Muyin Lan has gone in. I suppose he will become enlightened again, said one of them. Just then, they saw another person walk forward, which caused a strange look to appear on many of their faces, especially on the cultivators from the Nahai family. The person walking towards the front was none other than Futian. Nahai Ching had a nasty look in his eyes. Did this fellow want to enter the space too? Even though his great path was perfect, it was still not easy to barge in. But he also hoped that Futian would give it a shot, and the best would be if he died inside as well. Futian, murmured someone softly. Would he be able to go in? It was probably going to be difficult and rather risky. But Futian stood before the pillars and released small amounts of aura towards the light in between the pillars. In no time, the power of his great path flowed continuously into the space and merged with the great path of space inside. After that, everyone looked on in shock as Futian walked right in without running into any obstruction. He just walked right through and into the space in the middle of the pillars. All the cultivators watching felt their eyes widen, and their mouths fell open. How was this even possible? How did Yi Futian do this? Even though his great path was perfect, his cultivation level was low, and it was way off from Muyan Lan's level. How did he manage to go in with such ease? Even Na Haiqin, who had been hoping to watch Yi Futian die a horrible death moments ago, suddenly kept that thought away as he witnessed with his own eyes how Yi Futian had just walked right across this area and entered the space. Many of them felt that this was simply ridiculous. Never mind the rest of them, even Duan Qiong stared with his eyes and mouth wide open as he watched Yi Futian saunter into the space. That seemed a little too easy, didn't it? Even though Muyan Lan had made it before Yi Futian did, Muyan Lan ran into some difficulties and seemed to have managed to enter the space after being very cautious. But Yi Futian had just walked right in as if this space was no different from the outside world. This scene was challenging for anybody to explain. Even though this fellow is also gifted in great path of space, he's made the process look a little too simple, said someone incredulously. Even I want to give it a shot now, grumbled another. Indeed, after watching Yi Futian walk in so easily, many of them felt tempted to try. But it didn't take long for someone to learn his lesson. If he hadn't reacted quickly enough, he might have died on the spot. This really puzzled a lot of people. Why was Yi Futian able to do this so easily, but they ended up nearly losing their lives from merely trying? Only the ones who were close to Yi Futian thought this to be normal. They didn't look surprised at all, as if this was to be expected. He and Muyan Lan have both gone in. Would the two of them end up fighting? Someone suddenly asked in a low voice. The others realized all of a sudden that Yi Futian and Muyan Lan had quite the feud, and they had gotten into a really violent fight outside not too long ago. And now Yi Futian had gone in after Muyan Lan. Wasn't he asking to get beaten up again? In the earlier fight, the Nahai family and Muyan Lan didn't gain the upper hand and were actually kept at bay, so Muyan Lan might not actually dare to do anything to Yi Futian. Otherwise, nobody knows what would happen in the outside world, replied another. Many of them agreed. Anybody who witnessed the fight outside earlier knew very well that Yi Futian and the people of Four Corner Village had definitely gained the upper hand in that fight. If Muyan Lan tried to kill Yi Futian in there, nobody out here would be able to stop Blind Tai. Yi Futian understood this very well too. After he entered the space, he felt like he had come to a completely different world. Looking in from outside and being inside this world itself gave him a very different feeling altogether. He now felt that he had truly come to a completely different space world. It was very real, and it was neither an elusive realm nor a void space. It was a place a legendary character of the past used for cultivation. All the buildings in this place were pure white, and seemed to have been carved out of white jade. White jade pillars were tall enough to reach the sky as they held this place up and extended into the clouds. The beautiful sight before him gave him the feeling that he was now in a heavenly palace. Even the Donghua Palace of the Donghua Domain Chief's manor wasn't this majestic. This made Yi Futian believe that this was a place where some godlike person must have cultivated. The ruler of the Tsengyuan continent possibly sealed off the place where he cultivated so that it would not be destroyed and would survive till today. A solemnness rose in his heart as Yi Futian continued to walk ahead. But someone quietly stood in front of him and turned around to look at him. It was Muyan Lan who had come in earlier. He didn't expect Yi Futian to have come in after him. But even though he saw that Yi Futian had made it in here, there was no dramatic change in his gaze. He just looked at Yi Futian with some frostiness as he said in a distant tone of voice, "If I don't tell you to move, you shall stand there and not move." With that, he started walking forward. His voice had an authority that was not to be questioned, as if he had given Yi Futian the command to stand there, and he was not allowed to move. Yi Futian frowned. He knew that Muyan Lan wouldn't dare to do anything to him, but he didn't expect Muyan Lan's personality to be so audacious. He had come in here, but Muyan Lan didn't allow him to move. Yi Futian picked his feet up and started moving forward as well. But the moment he took one step out, Muyan Lan stopped walking as well. Beams of gold divine light that carried the power of the great path emanated out from him. Woom! All of a sudden, a golden figure appeared in front of Yi Futian. In an instant, the terrifying illusion of a golden-winged roc appeared from nowhere and came down murderously towards him. Its incredible pair of wings flapped and tore through the air as it made its way towards Futian. Futian shifted himself instantly and disappeared from where he was standing earlier to appear in a different place. But he soon realized that in the blink of an eye, several more illusions of golden-winged rocs had appeared before him. Each one seemed so real as they carried a ferocious aura while coming at him at the same time. They seemed to have drowned out the space here, and he had nowhere to escape to. At that moment, a gargantuan illusion of a peacock appeared behind Futian. It gave off countless beams of light from its body and attacked all the illusions of the golden-winged rocs. But they were unable to hold up against the attack power of the golden-winged rocs. Futian thrust his long spear outwards, only to see a golden-winged roc use its sharp claws to block the attack. It had actually used its razor-sharp claws to grab hold of the long spear as the other illusions continued to attack from other directions. The illusion of the peacock unleashed a glaring amount of divine light. It was as if it had come out from countless pairs of eyes at the same time, but it was still unable to fend off the force coming towards it that seemed to be able to blot out the sky. Bam! With a loud blast, Futian flew out from the impact and was sent far into the distance. At that moment, all the illusions disappeared as they merged into one and returned to Mian Lan's body. Those jealous-looking eyes were filled with cold-blooded and murderous thoughts. If not for the fact that he couldn't kill Futian now, he would have done it right now and gotten rid of this man. The power of level 8. The aura on Futian trembled as he looked up at Mian Lan in front of him. Mian Lan was at Rahuang level 8 perfect grade great path, and he was reaching its peak already, so he was practically invincible, while Futian's level was too far from his after all. Dealing with an ordinary level 8 Rahuang was no problem to him, and he would even have the upper hand. Still, Mian Lan was a compelling character from Four Corner Village and had experienced enlightenment. It was really way too difficult for him at level 5 to defeat Mian Lan. Everyone looking in from outside narrowed their eyes as they watched the battle. Mian Lan had seriously tried to attack Futian? But Mian Lan didn't seem like he intended to really kill Futian. There were too many things he had to consider, so he didn't dare to go too far. However, from what they could see, it looked like Mian Lan was purposely trying to stop Futian from discovering any secrets within that space. Blind Tai couldn't see what was going on inside, and he couldn't sense it either, but his ears twitched, and he could overhear the discussions among the rest of the people. His expression turned cold as he started walking towards where the cultivators from the Nehai family were standing. Nehai Qing and the rest immediately tensed up and were worried that Blind Tai was here to take revenge. "Do not make me repeat myself," said Mian Lan aggressively before continuing to walk on. It was as if he had been standing there without moving throughout the attack. "But I want to understand a level 8 Golden Rock Heaven Slayer technique." Futian ignored whatever Mian Lan said and continued walking forward. The blasts of great path resounded from his body as countless beams of divine light shot out from within his body. His whole body was filled with exuberant energy. Even though he was not at a level able to fight Mian Lan, who was at level 8 perfect grade great path, he didn't mind making use of Mian Lan to hone his fighting abilities. Before leaving the Donghua domain, he had heard that the most talented and powerful person of the domain, Ninghua, had already reached level 8. Regardless of whether it was Ninghua or Mian Lan, these were all rivals that he would eventually need to face in the future. So wasn't a chance to hone and perfect his skills a really rare chance? A tremendous amount of pressure filled the space. Futian's body served as the center of this pressure, and a starry dimension with innumerable stars surrounded him. A bright white moon hung high in the sky as it emanated a chilling air, causing the space to nearly freeze over. Mian Lan's body was suspended in the air as the incredibly glorious picture of the domineering golden pink bird appeared on his body. His gaze swept towards Futian and his murderous intentions intensified, but he tried his best to hold himself back. Chi-chi. A golden-winged roc flew out ferociously like a beam of light as it seemed to become a beautiful sword. This golden sword-like bird tore through the air and flew murderously towards Futian. Many more golden-winged rocks surrounded it as if they were determined to kill everything in their way. Futian shifted his consciousness, and the divine light from the frosty moon shone down on the legendary birds and affected their speed but was unable to destroy them. At the same time, he raised a hand and slammed it down, causing all the stars to instantly rain down towards the birds like divine monuments coming down from the sky. Bam! 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 It shattered all the force that it landed on, and even though the golden rocks continued to fly towards Futian, their strength had been greatly diminished. Many doors of space appeared in front of Futian and made their way towards those sword-like birds. The divine swords created by the golden-winged rocks broke through the doors and shattered them, but just then, a long spear attacked them, blocking the swords and blocking the attack. But in the same instant, a strong wind began to howl as an enormous bird smashed down from the sky as it aimed straight for Futian. The illusion of a peacock behind Futian unleashed an incredibly gorgeous light of the demon god from itself. The incomparably huge peacock shot into the sky as it became one with the divine light to collide with the bird that was smashing down. Boom! Futian was sent flying out again from the impact, and he gave a muffled cry. The blood force within his body roiled, but he caught his breath again almost instantly. He held a long spear in his hands and looked towards Yunlan. An eagerness to fight blazed in those eyes. Yunlan stared at Futian and could sense that eagerness to engage in battle from Futian's body. He could sense that Futian was making use of him to train himself up, and he knew that his threats didn't mean anything to Futian at all. They both knew very well that he didn't dare to do anything to Futian, so Futian ended up using his attacks to hone his fighting ability instead. When he realized this, Yunlan's expression darkened even further, and his murderous thoughts intensified greatly. But he had to think about the situation outside. Terrifying beams of divine light came down, and he wished he could kill Futian on the spot. But he couldn't do that. Yunlan spun around and left. He continued walking deeper into the space and didn't bother stopping Futian anymore. He knew there was no point in doing that, and he would only serve to benefit Futian instead. Futian felt that it was such a pity. It was so hard to find a rival at this level. An ordinary level 9 character wasn't his match either. But Yunlan had realized what Futian was trying to do, so he decided to just leave. Chapter 2158. The World Has No Path. Yunlan was in front, and Futian was in the back. The two of them walked on at the same time and passed many pillars that were so tall that they reached the clouds. Divine consciousness didn't work in this place, so they had to use their eyes to observe everything. They could vaguely sense a terrifying form of pressure in front, so they lifted their heads to look into the distance. They could make out a flight of stairs that extended high up towards the sky, and there were even more majestic-looking golden pillars at the top of the stairs. They sparkled brightly. It was as if there was something even more frightening to behold in that place. "What's over there?" thought both of them in their hearts. Yunlan had already started walking briskly towards the stairs. He didn't walk too quickly, but each step was strong and steady. Every step he took created a booming sound, making one feel a tremendous amount of pressure. This authoritative pressure wasn't something that he unleashed on purpose. It was a natural sort of formidability that made his expression grim as he fixed his gaze in front. His expression was bleak because he could sense that this series of chance encounters might really have led them to find an actual relic of the past, and it could really be something left behind by a truly incredible person of the past. Yunlan had been willing to marry into the Nahai family to become their son-in-law, not only for the sake of his cultivation. He used to be from the village and knew very little about anything else. His knowledge of the world outside was blurry and as good as none. He only knew about cultivation and his wish to go out and explore the world. After wandering out there for several years, his knowledge expanded. But it was only after he met Nahai Chenxue and came to the Nahai family that he found out about the great secrets of ancient times. That was when he realized that there were still so many astonishing secrets to be uncovered and many stories that had been buried in the long river of history. And since he was facing what could be the relic of a godlike character, he became very solemn, and his heart was tumultuous. The gods of ancient times were those who dared to fight the heavens and were heaven-defying existences themselves. This sort of undefeatable boldness was something that triggered his ambition. He wished he had been born in that era to have competed with the heavenly palace. Yi Futian looked equally solemn. But unlike Muyunlan, he was still in the process of searching while cultivating. He was searching for the secret of his own past, he was searching for the truth behind the world tree, and of course, he wanted to know what this world really was like. There were many things that he felt like he had come into contact with but wasn't able to see clearly. But as his cultivation level continued to rise, he was beginning to inch toward the truth slowly. When he reached the stairs, he also felt this odd authoritative pressure coming from it. This pressure was ancient and solemn, and wasn't brought here by some other power. It seemed like the purest form of might. It had no form or shape, but it weighed heavily on him and made him feel like he was suffocating. Yi Futian started walking up the stairs. His body was surrounded by the glow of the divine light of Great Path as if he was a divine being himself, but the divine light of Great Path didn't seem as pretty or eye-catching in this place. On the contrary, it seemed somewhat dim, as if that mighty pressure had kept everything under its control, which caused Yi Futian to feel that the power he had didn't seem to do any wonders for him, and he had to rely on his own body to endure everything that came his way. "What's up there?" wondered Yi Futian. His heart was immensely calm. He looked up into the sky, and there was some anticipation in his eyes. But there was no way he could increase his speed, and he had no choice but to go up one step at a time. In front of him, Muyunlan had stopped walking, and his breathing seemed to have quickened. He hadn't released any aura and did not unleash any of his Great Path power. It was clear that Muyunlan had gone through the same thing as Yi Futian. He had also realized that the powers he had were useless because this authoritative pressure had no regard for any Great Path power. It was a pressure that weighed on one's spirit. But after a few moments, he continued walking up. Yi Futian followed behind him. His breathing started to quicken as well. He didn't stop and began to close the gap between himself and Muyunlan. The two of them continued to walk higher and higher up the stairs. When Muyunlan stopped again, he was left with only the last 3 steps. He took a deep breath, then picked up his feet and went up again. He stood at the top of the stairs, and for one moment, Muyunlan's gaze froze. He stood where he was without budging an inch, and just stared straight ahead. Yi Futian figured that Muyunlan must have seen something. He continued walking up from behind Muyunlan, finally reaching the top and stood on the landing. After that, his gaze was also frozen like Muyunlan's, and he, too, stood there without moving as he stared at what was in front of him. And so, the people outside witnessed a bizarre scene before them. These two enemies were actually standing side by side, quietly looking ahead. The people outside couldn't see exactly what was there, and could only see an extremely bright ball of light. What did they see? Everyone's hearts trembled as a strong sense of curiosity overwhelmed them. These two were archenemies. What could they have seen that would make them stand there without moving the slightest bit? Many of them wished they could also go in to see what was there. But until now, the two of them were the only ones able to enter the space. Nobody else had been able to go in. If they wanted to know what the two of them had seen, they had to wait for them to come back out. At the same time, inside the space, Muyunlan and Yi Futian were faced with a glaring flash of golden divine light. The gleaming diving light was so glaring that their eyes hurt. This place seemed to have been a place where one cultivated. Characters were carved into the pillars that seemed to reach the sky, and they were all over the floor as well. It looked like a gigantic formation, and it also resembled an altar. But right in the middle of this area, Muyunlan and Yi Futian saw a golden coffin. That glorious golden divine light emanated from this golden coffin, and it hurt their eyes to look upon it. The mighty pressure was coming from this coffin as well, and it made both of them pant heavily. Even though they were powerful, they felt like their legs were about to give way. That was how frightening the pressure was. In this place, it seemed like none of the Great Path power was of any use. The might that shone on them had eliminated all the power they had. It's those words. Muyunlan and Yi Futian looked towards the words written on the pillars. 5 pillars had 5 different words on them. The world has no and path. The world has no path, Mu-Yun-Lan murmured to himself. Just when he was about to unleash the great path aura within him, it was instantly distinguished. For as long as the divine light of those ancient words shone down on him, the great path did not exist. No path existed in this space. The world has no path. Futian was equally shaken as he murmured these 5 words to himself. What did they mean? What was the path here referring to? The world had no path? Then what was the power that they had all been cultivating? If this sort of power existed, then why did it disappear completely in this space? Why wasn't it able to exist in this space? Mu-Yun-Lan and Futian's hearts were both filled with questions as they looked towards that coffin. Bam! Futian stepped out, which caused the floor to resonate loudly. Even though his movement was extremely limited within this space, he still took that step out anyway. The strength of the world tree within his body slowly spread through the rest of his body, which filled his body with strength. Mu-Yun-Lan's expression froze when he noticed Futian's movement. He tried to take a step forward only to find that he wasn't able to. It was already not easy for him to remain standing under this tremendous pressure. But Futian was actually able to continue walking. Did that mean he wasn't as powerful as Futian? Mu-Yun-Lan was a proud man by nature, so even though Futian had made a name for himself recently and was incredibly gifted, he didn't think that he would be any less than Futian. But after they had both entered this relic and come here, he didn't have any more strength to keep walking, while Futian could continue walking ahead. This was a terrible blow to Mu-Yun-Lan's pride. The great path resonated within his body, and it seemed like divine light was flickering behind him as he forced himself to take a step forward. But all of this was quickly extinguished by that formless divine light from the coffin. Pfft! Mu-Yun-Lan made a muffled noise as blood dribbled from his lips, but he still insisted on taking this step forward. He looked towards the front to see that Futian was still walking ahead. He was walking very slowly, but he had already made 3 steps forward. Futian seemed to have sensed Mu-Yun-Lan's movement, so he turned back to glance at Mu-Yun-Lan to see that Mu-Yun-Lan was still trying to move forward despite bleeding from the mouth and nose. If he went on like this, he might end up bleeding from even more places. This man was naturally proud and was one who refused to give up or give in. But this obstinance wasn't always a good thing. Futian had taken more steps forward only because the world tree wasn't affected by the divine light, and had given him more strength. Otherwise, he would have remained where he was. The path of cultivation is not an easy one. Don't go down the path of destruction, said Futian in a low voice. Mu-Yun-Lan looked at him. Was Futian advising him now? Was he mocking him? Or was he laughing at his misfortune? If you die like this, then I'd have one rival less. It's better if you leave yourself alive for me to kill, continued Futian. After that, he didn't care about him anymore and took yet another step forward. Mu-Yun-Lan was bleeding from more places now, so he ended up giving up. He moved his body backward to stand at the edge of the staircase once again, and didn't dare to try moving forward anymore. Meanwhile, Futian had already reached the coffin. The glaring rays of light made it hard for him to open his eyes, so he used a hand to block some of it. He looked towards the inside of the coffin, and his heart pounded wildly as his hand froze. He had just taken one look, and Futian let out a tragic-sounding yelp as his body was sent flying right out. He crashed into one of the pillars and vomited a mouthful of fresh blood. Blood was also seeping out from his eyes, and he looked awful. Mu-Yun-Lan felt his own heart pound wildly when he saw this. He stared straight at that coffin, then looked towards Futian. He watched as Futian put a hand over his eyes, and it was dyed red by blood. The energy from the world tree within his body extended to his eyes. He slowly moved his hand away, and the blood had all dried up. His eyes opened again to look towards the coffin. What's there? Mu-Yun-Lan couldn't help but ask Futian even though he knew Futian was injured. Futian's gaze looked back at where Mu-Yun-Lan was standing. Mu-Yun-Lan looked back at him as if he was waiting for a response from Futian. What was inside this coffin? At that moment, Muyin Lan felt his heart pound wildly on its own accord. But even though Yi Futian wanted to say something, he didn't say anything in the end. His heart was also pounding equally wildly. What on earth is it? Muyin Lan asked again since Yi Futian didn't answer. His eyes glowed with curiosity. The thing almost blinded Yi Futian and left him open-mouthed. What could it possibly be? What was hidden inside of a divine casket that was sealed in the mysterious site of relics of ancient gods? Was it a body? Could it be the remains of ancient gods if it was indeed a body? Sacred remains? Yi Futian still didn't answer Muyin Lan's question. It was not that he didn't want to reply but that he couldn't tell what it was or to put it into words. Was it a corpse? He had trouble describing it clearly. While he still felt staggered and disconcerted at this moment, he was also filled with wonder and a strong urge to explore. His eyes, which had recovered from temporary blindness, were glued to the divine casket. Beams of divine light illuminated his body. It was imperial glory instead of the ordinary divine light of the Great Path. His eyes reflected the dazzling light and shone brilliantly as if they were eyes of God. He stepped forward again, walking over to the divine casket. He wanted to give it another try to identify the thing in the casket. He was almost blinded just now for taking a brief look. Any other cultivator at the same level would have lost his sight already. Muyin Lan clenched his fists and stared at Yi Futian without blinking. This jerk wouldn't tell him what was inside the casket. Muyin Lan exerted himself to move a step forward, attempting to take a look himself. Even if you managed to get here, you probably would be blinded after one quick look. Do you really want to try? A cold voice said to Muyin Lan. Muyin Lan dropped the idea right away. He stood frozen to the ground and was at a loss for words. He certainly had been performing worse than Yi Futian even though he was unwilling to admit it. He saw what kind of price Yi Futian paid to look inside the casket, and he knew he was very likely to be blinded if he tried it himself. Of course, Muyin Lan noticed how Yi Futian was glowing with the imperial glory as well. Yi Futian was fortunate enough to obtain the will of the great emperor during a serendipitous encounter. Perhaps it was why he was better than Muyin Lan, and was confident enough to try again. Yi Futian walked extremely slowly. Each of his footsteps was heavy. It was as if he was carrying tons of weight. He paused for a second when he reached the divine casket. His eyes already turned into a rich and bright golden color as though they were brightened by the divine light. Yi Futian approached the divine casket one more time to look inside. In an instant, countless rays of divine light pierced into Yi Futian's eyes. He felt excruciating pain in his eyes, and even his spiritual soul was shaken violently. The blinding golden divine light seemed to be an endless flow of runes. Each rune was left by the ancient gods and contained enigmatic power. More remarkably, the countless runes all seemed to be coming from a body, which was essentially made up of golden runes. It was a corpse indeed. The sacred remains. However, the dazzling and magnificent sacred remains didn't have blood, flesh, or bones. Even if a god died, his body would never decompose, and his blood wouldn't dry out either. Moreover, he could resurrect himself even if he only had one drop of blood or one patch of skin left. Yi Futian couldn't imagine what gods were capable of, but at least they would have bodies that could last forever. That being said, the sacred remains in front of him were composed of innumerable runes. It was a spectacular sight. But Yi Futian felt a strong, sharp pain in his eyes. He let out an agonized yelp and fell back. 2 streams of blood trickled from his eyes and made him look miserable. Even though he was well prepared this time, Yi Futian couldn't endure the pain for more than a split second. The runes that formed the remains thrust into his eyes and head. He couldn't persevere in the face of this kind of power. Was this developed after a god's death? Yi Futian was astounded even though this was not the first sacred remains that he saw. In the past, he had encountered the divine heart of the peacock left by the peacock demon god. What did the sacred remains mean this time? At the moment, this area in the outer realms was surrounded by a lot of cultivators. They were all eager to know what was going on inside. Why did Muyin Lan stop moving forward? What happened to him? Yi Futian, as opposed to Muyin Lan, walked into the area that couldn't be discerned. Did it mean that Yi Futian was doing better than Muyun Lan in the relic? All of a sudden, everyone sensed the formidable authority of heaven. Many of them raised their heads to look in the direction of the source of the terrifying energy. They immediately saw a person appear in the sky above them. It was an old man with an ethereal quality. His long, white beard was flowing in the wind, making him look like a deity. Who is that? Everyone's heart was pounding with excitement and anticipation. The cultivators from the Nahai family bowed to the old man and said, "Greetings to the clan leader." The clan leader of the Nahai family was here. The crowd was almost blown away. No one expected to see master cultivators here, let alone the preeminent leader of the Nahai family. He arrived so quickly. It seemed that the cultivators from the Nahai family informed him of the situation, which attracted him here at once. The clan leader of the Nahai family gazed at the area below with a solemn expression. He asked, "How was this discovered?" After years of raiding and plundering, they thought there was no valuable relic left in the Tsengyuan continent. This was why it was shocking for them to see the situation here. This meant that they missed one of the most important relics on this continent. "This area came into sight after someone solved the mystery by chance," a person replied. The clan leader of the Nahai family was lost for words. Was it that simple? Nevertheless, it was meaningless to inquire about the details or regret the past. Instead, he focused on the present and watched the area intently. Just when he was about to make a move, another burst of fierce energy arrived. A voice rang out in midair. "I was wondering what Brother Nahai was rushing for. It turns out that there is God's relic on the Tsengyuan continent." Before the voice faded, another master cultivator came into view. "Brother Nahai, it's quite selfish of you to not share the news with us." A succession of master cultivators showed up, one of whom looked like a majestic ruler in his lavish imperial robe. The sovereign of the Shangyu deity nation. It appeared that most of the mighty figures of the upper third heaven had arrived. They all went to the Shangqing continent at the request of the domain chief's manor. However, the leaders of the Nahai family and the Yin family left abruptly, which caught the attention of other master cultivators. They followed them here, which led to what happened just now. The crowd was electrified to see the most prominent cultivators arriving one after another. The domain chief's manor invited them over. Yet who would have thought that they all gathered here in the Tsengyuan continent? Everyone could feel a great force of intense pressure pressing down over their bodies because of these mighty figures' presence. However, they were only staring at the area below while unleashing terrifying energy to surround the pillars. Subsequently, the crowd was hit by a strong yet invisible wave. It felt like a surreal spatial storm to the cultivators nearby. "Back off!" a voice boomed in the void. The cultivators immediately pulled back. But the invisible undulation of energy grew more intense. It turned into a gale and was transformed into a real spatial storm. But a wicked storm struck again, and blinding light flooded the space. At this moment, all of the wrecked buildings were once again smashed to smithereens, dust clouds blowing in the wind. After the storm finally subsided, the crowd standing far away suddenly realized that the area had changed. To everyone's astonishment, numerous stone pillars soared into the clouds as if they were part of a splendid divine palace. "This is what's inside!" Many people felt their hearts pounding rapidly. Was the divine palace inside the relic moved out by the master cultivators by force? Yi Futian and Muyun Lan naturally sensed the change as well. They raised their heads to look at the people hovering in the air. Although he had never met any of them, Yi Futian knew that they were mighty figures from various top forces. Old Ma. Yi Futian recognized Old Ma, who was behind the crowd. Old Ma followed other people here too. "Father-in-law!" Muyun Lan shouted at the clan leader of the Nahai family. The man nodded and responded, "Muyun Lan, pull back for now." Muyun Lan nodded slightly. There was no point for him to stay now that the master cultivators had arrived. Before he made a quick exit, he darted a glance at Yi Futian. Yi Futian was quietly withdrawing from the area. Even so, many master cultivators in the air noticed him. They stared at him for a while, surprised that he could approach the divine casket. In fact, the master cultivators were also astounded to see that it was a divine casket. As soon as they focused their attention on the inside of the divine casket, several of them closed their eyes. Others shrieked and immediately teleported away, then reappeared in the sky extremely far away. "What is that?" a voice echoed through the area. Even the clan leader of the Nehai family drew back without looking at the casket. His eyes closed tightly. "Ugh!" The spectators were stunned by their reaction. What on earth was inside the dazzling divine casket? Even the most powerful cultivators recoiled in horror. There was no doubt that it was something left by the ancient gods. A cultivator from the Nehai family rose into the air, trying to sneak a peek. But the clan leader bellowed, "Back off! You can't look at it!" Startled, the man stopped right away. He understood that he had to curb his curiosity when he saw the expression on the clan leader's face. He couldn't even cast a brief look at the divine casket. The master cultivators stood in different directions and seemed extremely cautious. Even people as powerful as them didn't dare to look. One could well imagine what kind of horrific thing was lying inside the divine casket. "Is it him?" someone asked the clan leader of the Nehai family. He was awfully afraid and didn't have the courage to look himself. "Yes." The clan leader of the Nehai family nodded and replied. "I'm surprised that the remains of an ancient legend are preserved till today," the person exclaimed. "Father-in-law, whose body was it?" Muyan asked. It turned out that his guess was right. It was sacred remains indeed. However, how could a corpse contain so much terrifying power that even the master cultivators had to stay away? "If I'm correct, this should be Xinjiao the Great Emperor," the clan leader of the Nehai family said in a low and solemn voice. Even he felt deep respect and admiration for such a legendary figure. The majority of the world had never heard about Xinjiao the Great Emperor. Only the master cultivators vaguely knew something about him. It was arcane history from ancient times. Ordinary cultivators outside of the most influential families couldn't possibly obtain such information. On top of that, even the families that rose to prominence in recent years didn't have chances to access the secret stories from ancient times. It had to be aristocratic families with a long lineage. Xinjiao the Great Emperor who didn't believe in the heavenly path? Mu Yunlan was taken aback. He had learned about the little-known stories of many mighty figures in ancient times since he married into the Nehai family. Many supreme cultivators achieved spectacular feats and left a mark in the history of time. Xinjiao the Great Emperor was one of them. He didn't worship the heavenly path and dared to challenge the mainstream belief. He once carved the words heaven and earth to demonstrate unmatched confidence and firm resolve to confront heaven. He didn't believe in the heavenly path. Futian silently repeated Muyunlan's words. Astonished, he looked at the runes on the stone pillars. This supreme cultivator in ancient times didn't believe in the heavenly path and built these stone pillars to destroy the established great path. What kind of bold vision and elevated state of mind he had! Futian could hardly imagine. What on earth was the highest level of cultivation? He once heard that the heavenly path collapsed because it was broken during the Great War from the distant past. Now he couldn't help but wonder if the heavenly path came apart because there were too many marvelous cultivators competing against heaven at that time. It would be a shocking history if his speculation were true. Nevertheless, no one knew what exactly happened in the past. At least Futian couldn't figure it out yet. He had cultivated for such a long time and thought that he had acquired plenty of knowledge. Nowadays, however, it was becoming clear to him that there were much more that he didn't know. He felt like an ignorant child. Now, almost all the master cultivators in the Shangqing domain were daunted by a corpse of an ancient legend. They couldn't even take a brief look without undergoing tremendous pressure and risk. Who could come near the sacred remains? At this moment, another person stepped forward and looked down into the divine casket. It was the overlord of the Shangyu deity nation. His body was releasing terrifying energy, and his eyes glowed with the divine light. His gaze penetrated the space and focused on the sacred remains directly. Nonetheless, even with his dominant power and thorough preparation, he only held on for a short moment before shifting his eyes away. Although he managed to look at the sacred remains for a longer time than the clan leader of the Nahai family did, it didn't mean that he was stronger than him. He was more prepared. "It's undoubtedly Xinjiao the Great Emperor," the overlord of the Shangyu deity nation said. "Rumor has it that Xinjiao the Great Emperor was able to transform the Great Emperor into runes. His physical body was invincible and imperishable as a result of long time and high-level cultivation. I would have never thought that I could see his sacred remains so many years later. Even though Xinjiao the Great Emperor has already passed on, his body here is probably still in a class of its own." His remarks tantalized many people. Overlord Shangyu had a point. Anyone who could control the sacred remains would be unrivaled in the divine prefecture. Apart from Dongwang the Great Emperor, who could prevail over the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor of ancient times. Although the sacred remains could be used as the ultimate weapon, ordinary folks could barely take a look, let alone control it. Notwithstanding, the lack of ability didn't stop people from fantasizing about it. Who didn't want to become the unparalleled fighter in the world? All of a sudden, the wind started to gust, and the clouds rolled in. Another person arrived while carrying intimidating power with him. The crowd looked up at the sky. The master cultivators already realized who just turned up. It seemed that it would be difficult for them to seize hold of the sacred remains for themselves now. "I invited all of you to come to the Shangqing continent. Yet it looks like you are all gathered here instead." The crowd heard his voice before seeing his face. Everyone raised their heads and saw a middle-aged man emerging in the sky. His hair was completely gray even though he seemed to be only 40 years old. Judging by his handsome face and majestic bearing, it was not hard for people to guess his identity. He was the domain chief of the Shangqing domain. "Domain chief, you're here too." The master cultivators greeted him one after another. The chief nodded and looked in the direction of the divine casket. He said, "Who would have thought that there are sacred remains hidden in a relic on the Tsengyuan continent in the Shangqing domain? We would have turned the Tsengyuan continent upside down if we knew that the body of Xinjiao the Great Emperor still existed. The top forces surely would do their utmost to thoroughly search through the Tsengyuan continent if they had known before. However, things would become tricky now that the domain chief had personally come. Everyone was conceiving all sorts of sinister plots in their heads before the chief's arrival. But it would be even harder for them to get their hands on the sacred remains now." The domain chief shot a glance at the divine casket and said, "It's Xinjiao the Great Emperor indeed." He bowed slightly to the divine casket below to show his respect for the ancient legend. Then, he scanned the crowd and announced, "Let's head to the Shangqing continent together since you are all here. I will bring the divine casket to the domain chief's manor and report to the Dongwang Imperial Palace later." Everyone's heart sunk upon hearing his decision. The domain chief's plan was indisputable. The others might be able to question him if he only said to bring the casket back to the domain chief's manor. But he specifically added that he would report it to the Dongwang Imperial Palace later, which meant that he would only hold the divine casket temporarily for safekeeping. Who could challenge his decision after he stated his intention of waiting for Dongwang the Great Emperor's instruction? That being said, it was unclear how long he planned to keep the divine casket in the domain chief's manor before reporting to the Dongwang Imperial Palace. He might hold on to it for a while. Either way, his argument was watertight. It's extremely rare to encounter the sacred remains of the great emperor in early ancient times. Domain chief, after you bring the casket back to the Shangqing continent, can we study it together for a while to make some progress in cultivation? The overlord Shangyu suggested. They had to compromise at this point for a chance to study the sacred remains. At the very least, they couldn't let the domain chief hog it for himself. No problem, of course. Any cultivator would be eager to study such a divine body from the early ancient times. The domain chief nodded and said, I understand what you mean. Thank you, domain chief. Everyone nodded in agreement. It would be inappropriate for them to push further at this point. Nonetheless, none of them was satisfied with the arrangement. The domain chief settled the issue of jurisdiction over the sacred remains moments after his arrival. The last word belonged to the most powerful person for sure. No one cared or inquired about the person who discovered the relic in the first place, as if it didn't matter at all. Of course, it was only a trivial detail indeed. Let's go back to the Shangqing continent together since we're all here, the domain chief said. Then he turned his eyes to the area below. With a deafening sound, the earth quaked violently. Cracks appeared one by one as though the ground was about to be split open. The intense divine light of the great path illuminated the area. The domain chief made a grabbing gesture with his hand, and the entire relic was uprooted, creating a series of thundering noises. The onlookers were stunned to see the domain chief attempting to move the relic away in one piece. The whole site slowly rose into the air like a castle. It was encased in the form of fearsome energy. The power of the casket was contained and did not affect the movement. "Let's go," the domain chief said. He set out right away while carrying the relic. The clan leader of the Nahai family looked down at Nahai Qianxue and Yunlan. "Come up." "Yes." They joined him and left together. A master cultivators also brought their youngsters along with them. "Let's set off too." Old Ma, who had been standing by the side quietly, finally spoke to Futian and the others. Duan Tianxiong was right next to Old Ma. He nodded slightly at Futian and joined them as well. Everyone from the top forces left the scene before long. Many cultivators who had no one to bring them along with could only lament the lack of chance to even go near the divine relic. People of Four Corner Village were traveling together with cultivators from the ancient royal family of Duan. Futian asked Duan Tianxiong, "Your Majesty, have you heard about Xinjia the Great Emperor before?" "Only a little." Duan Tianxiong nodded and replied. "He didn't believe in the heavenly path and challenged the gods. The supreme cultivators in early ancient times were often determined to compete against heaven since they had reached the pinnacle of cultivation. Xinjia the Great Emperor was one of them. Nevertheless, even I couldn't imagine that kind of ultimate power. We don't have people like that anymore." Futian was deeply moved by the story. Cultivation had no limit. But did it mean that a cultivator had to take on the gods when he reached the peak? To challenge the heavenly path? Even Duan Tianxiong could hardly imagine a spirit like that. How would the contemporary great emperor compare with the great emperors in ancient times? The Shangqing continent was definitely the key area in the Shangqing domain. It was visible from afar away. Futian and the others initially planned to head straight to the Shangqing continent. However, they had to take a detour because of what happened in the Tsengyuan continent. Now that the situation was resolved, they followed other cultivators and marched to their original destination through the infinite space. Soon, they arrived at Qing City, which was the capital of the Shangqing continent. Qing City was a hot spot for cultivators of different forces from every corner of the domain. The domain chief's manor had sent the invitation to all the groups, and they welcomed visitors and representatives with open arms. Rumor had it that the domain chief's manor summoned everyone this time because critical changes were happening within the divine prefecture, and war might break out. A lot of people were desperate to know who the divine prefecture would be fighting. What kind of a disastrous calamity would it be if the entire divine prefecture was engaged in war? Countless people gathered in a remote area and gazed at the domain chief's manor, which was the most powerful cultivation group in the entire Shangqing domain. It was a wonderland for many cultivators who longed to join the domain chief's manor and cultivate there. At this moment, the crowd suddenly felt a burst of intense energy coming from the sky. A distant booming sound froze everyone in their tracks. Their hearts trembled with fear. Who on earth was coming? How could someone stir up such a storm? The cultivators inside the domain chief's manor certainly sensed the disturbance as well. One after another, they sprang up and took to the air, gazing at the sky far away. At once, they saw a shocking and thrilling scene. A group of people came into sight in the sky. In the meantime, however, there was also a grand building moving along their side. It seemed that an entire piece of land was uprooted and brought here. "It's the domain chief." Everyone in the domain chief's manor was amazed and electrified. "What is happening? Did the domain chief move a whole city here?" None of the cultivators understood what was going on. Moments later, they saw that the domain chief slammed the floating city down from the sky. With a rumbling noise, the imposing structure landed on the vacant lot outside of the domain chief's manor, which happened to be large enough to accommodate it. What? The cultivators in the domain chief's manor immediately sprinted out toward the lot. They were eager to check out the mysterious structure. The spectators outside of the domain chief's manor were also filled with curiosity and desired to look. Send people to guard the area. No one is allowed to lay eyes on the thing inside the divine casket. I hereby proclaim a strict ban on approaching the area for cultivators of the domain chief's manor. Anyone who violated the ban would lose his vision or even life. The outside cultivators are also prohibited from looking at the divine casket. The trespassers will face the consequence themselves. A firm and solemn voice rang out. Everyone was astounded and perplexed at the same time. A divine casket? What was inside? Moreover, the domain chief warned that anyone who took a look would lose their vision, or even be killed. How horrifying! That being said, the domain chief's injunction only made people burning with curiosity. What could be inside? Why did he prohibit people from approaching it? Domain chief, what is that? One of the cultivators from the domain chief's manor asked directly. The sacred remains. The domain chief gave a straightforward answer. The event that occurred in the Tsengyuan continent would be made public in less than no time. He might as well tell the truth now. The sacred remains. The domain chief brought back the sacred remains. Every cultivator, both inside and outside the domain chief's manor, was astonished by the answer. They were even more intrigued now. However, they were deterred by the domain chief's warning and didn't dare to act recklessly. Only now did the crowd notice the cultivators following the domain chief. Everyone behind the domain chief seemed intimidating and unapproachable. They probably were mighty figures who came back to the manor along with the domain chief. I will send someone to inform to the Dongwang Imperial Palace as soon as I return to the domain chief's manor. Would you like to stay for a few days in the domain chief's manor to get some rest? The domain chief said to the people behind him. They darted a glance at the divine casket below. The clan leader of the Nahai family answered on their behalf. There is no need to trouble you. We will stay in town, waiting for your order. We can go to the domain chief's manor whenever you need. Besides, they were allowed to check out the divine casket at any time anyway. All right. The domain chief nodded and said, In that case, I will not take up more of your time. Please suit yourselves. I will invite you over in a few days when the Dongwang Imperial Palace enlightens me as far as the next step. Everyone nodded their consent. They took another look at the divine casket and left separately. Let's go, too, Old Ma said to Futian and the others. They left with the cultivators from the ancient royal family of Duan and found an inn in the city to stay in. After the domain chief and other master cultivators left, the news about the divine casket and the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor swept across the capital of the Shangqing continent. Astonished and intrigued, a large number of people flocked to the area outside of the domain chief's manor, eager to have a look. The domain chief's warning also spread widely. It was said that even the domain chief and other master cultivators couldn't look directly at the sacred remains when they were back in the Tsengyuan continent. Average renhuangs would suffer a gruesome death even if they only sneaked a peek. Even so, the more grisly the rumor became, the more people gathered outside of the domain chief's manor. After he settled down in the inn, Futian couldn't concentrate on cultivation. His mind was still occupied by the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor in the divine casket. At this point, Duan Qiong happened to come to look for him. He said, Brother Yi. Futian stopped cultivating and turned his eyes to Duan Qiong. Duan Qiong asked, Are you able to focus? Futian smiled and shook his head. He couldn't concentrate. Earlier today, you saw the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor in the divine casket, right? If not for what happened after that, perhaps you could have cultivated with it for a while longer and might have even learned or discovered something. But we probably don't have a chance now since the domain chief has taken the divine casket away. he will likely submit the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor to the Donghuang Imperial Palace before long. Of course, Yi Futian understood it as well. It was disappointing to miss the rare opportunity. He might be able to make considerable progress if he could really study the body of Xinjiao the Great Emperor. Duan Qiong noticed Yi Futian's expression and said with a smile, "Let's go. People are gathering outside of the domain chief's manor. I even heard some people in the inn talking about it. We should check it out too. Maybe you can have more time with the sacred remains and comprehend something." Good. Yi Futian nodded and answered at once. He was not thrilled that the domain chief seized hold of the divine casket. But he didn't have enough power to challenge him. The master cultivators swarmed to the relic and dominated the situation. Even Mu Yunlan was a nobody in front of them, let alone Yi Futian. Those mighty figures didn't even notice their existence. Yi Futian had no choice but to watch the divine casket being taken away. The opportunity slipped through his fingers. Not only were Duan Qiong and Yi Futian of the same mind, but Blind Tai and the others also came to join them. Soon, they returned to the area outside of the domain chief's manor. The neighborhood looked completely different now. Countless cultivators thronged the streets. The crowd made an awful din. A lot of powerful cultivators were guarding the divine casket. An arrogant Renhuang, who rebelled against the warning, was blinded after one brief look in the casket. Chapter 2162, Archenemy. Although the domain chief issued a ban, he also said that outsiders who disregarded his warning and insisted on examining the divine casket would suffer the consequences. Therefore, the guards sent by the domain chief's manor would only put people on notice. If someone really attempted to break through the barrier, they wouldn't stop the interloper by force. As a result, the Renhuang, who was quite famous in Qing City, became the first sacrifice. Stumbling through the crowd, he was still bleeding from his eyes and shrieking in agony. However, what happened to this Renhuang served as a cautionary tale for everyone else. The domain chief was not exaggerating to scare people. Whatever was inside the divine casket could blind people in an instant. Countless cultivators gathered outside of the domain chief's manor. Both the ground and midair were seething with people. They were all tempted to take a look, but few had the courage and confidence. At this moment, a person walked in long strides toward the space above the divine casket. Many people noticed him and were impressed by his dignified manner. He certainly was not an ordinary man. A beautiful woman behind him reminded him, "Be careful. He is going to give it a try." The crowd watched him with bated breath. This cultivator stepped forward to check out the divine casket. "That's Nahai Qianxue, the precious daughter of the Nahai family. The man is her husband, Mu Yunlan," someone in the crowd said loudly. The spectators made a loud din. Mu Yunlan, the renowned genius from the Nahai continent, also came to inspect the divine casket. Yi Futian, who was also standing in the crowd, focused his eyes on Mu Yunlan. It seemed to him that Mu Yunlan felt bitter about his failed attempt in the Tsengyuan continent. He was eager to have another try after they arrived at the Shangqing continent. Mu Yunlan was disgruntled and resentful indeed. Back on the Tsengyuan continent, he couldn't move forward at all despite his burning desire to take a look at the inside of the divine casket. He kept asking Yi Futian what was inside, but Yi Futian never responded. Mu Yunlan felt deeply humiliated in that circumstance. His father-in-law and other master cultivators arrived shortly after that. Even with their tremendous power, they couldn't look directly at the sacred remains in the divine casket. Now, Mu Yunlan was more eager to see how terrifying the sacred remains truly were, and why most people couldn't take a brief look. Mu Yunlan was fully prepared this time. On top of that, he planned to look down at the divine casket from above, so he wouldn't be repelled by the potent force again. His body was illuminated and shielded by the brilliant divine light of the great path, and his eyes glowed with a golden radiance. He kept moving forward and reached the sky above the divine casket. With one glance at the divine casket, he seemed to see endless runes of the great path instead of a dead man's body. Those runes of the great path immediately blasted into his eyes. The ancient characters bludgeoned the way through his defense, and stabbed at his eyes in a split second. No matter how strong a cultivator might be, the eyes were always the vulnerable spots. Although Muyan was mentally prepared, he had to hurry to close his eyes. He stumbled several steps back, his body shaking violently. The onlookers saw him covering his eyes with both hands. Blood seeped through his fingers and streamed down his cheeks. Many people were struck dumb by the scene. The crowd stood in shocked silence, watching Muyan suffering in midair. Even a forceful cultivator like him was wounded so badly that he was bleeding from his eyes. People could only guess what the sacred remains could do to an average man. Muyan would lose his vision if he tried again. The magnitude of the danger was beyond anyone's imagination. What on earth did Muyan see? No one dared to take a look at something right in front of them. It also sounded ridiculous. Nahai Chinchua ran to check on Muyan. Muyan removed his hands and shook his head at her. He said, "I'm all right." Despite what he said to comfort his wife, he could still feel the sharp pain in his eyes and would never forget the amount of power contained in each rune. "Don't look at it again," Nahai Chinchua said in a soft voice. Although she was rather intrigued, she curbed her curiosity and didn't try it herself. "Yes," Muyan nodded and replied. One glimpse was enough for him. At least he saw what was in the divine casket with his own eyes and finally let go of the obsession that had started on the Tsengyuan continent. He cast his mind back and finally understood why Futian didn't answer his questions even after looking at the sacred remains several times. Futian probably didn't know how to put it into words. "Muyan, how did it feel?" someone asked. A lot of prominent cultivators were watching Muyan in the front rows. They were cultivators from various top forces. A few of them stopped at the Tsengyuan continent before, but most came directly to the Shangqing continent, and only learned about the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor from the elders. No matter how many years it has been since Xinjiao the Great Emperor's demise, his sacred remains are not something that are to desecrated by us. We don't even get to catch a glimpse. I suppose that only a great emperor who dared to challenge the heavenly path would be able to achieve that," Muyan exclaimed. He had lost his usual arrogance. How could he remain to be self-satisfied when he couldn't even look at a corpse? As an 8th Order Renhuang with a perfect great path, he was virtually unrivaled among his peers. Apart from several master cultivators, only a handful of cultivators in the entire Shangqing domain were in the same league as him. Nevertheless, as strong as he might be, he was a puny ant who was absolutely incomparable with Xinjiao the Great Emperor. The more powerful the cultivator was, the more deeply he understood cultivation and the humbler he became. Many people were surprised by Muyan's remark. They noticed the abrupt change in him and felt different from what he used to be. People who were familiar with Muyan knew him as an extremely arrogant and proud man. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but be humbled by the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor. "I heard that someone outdid you on the Tsengyuan continent," a person said. With an indecipherable expression, Muyan answered, "Yes." As a matter of fact, Futian was more successful than him when they both tried to break into the relic on the Tsengyuan continent. He couldn't deny it. "Where did this Futian come from?" "I heard that he forced his way into the palace of the ancient royal family of Duan, and no one could stop him," someone asked. Duan Qiong is the most outstanding cultivator in the ancient royal family of Duan. They also have several other 9th Order Renhuangs, albeit not as good as Duan Qiong. It's said that Futian is only a 5th Order Renhuang. Such an impressive feat is enough to make him famous throughout the Shangqing domain. Another person chimed in. These people participating in the conversation were all distinguished cultivators from different top forces. Futian was a name that came up more and more often nowadays, and they even heard people in the Shangqing continent talking about him a few times. "He should be here too," someone muttered while scanning the crowd, trying to find Futian. Duan Qiong was not thrilled to hear these people building Futian up at the expense of the ancient royal family of Duan. Nevertheless, he didn't take it to heart since he had become Futian's friend. Before long, a lot of people fixed their gaze on Duan Qiong and Futian. Apparently, they recognized both of them. Plenty of people were familiar with Duan Qiong. They presumed that the silver-haired man next to him was Yi Futian. He was a handsome and dashing man dressed in white with a graceful manner. Yi Futian stood in place quietly. Many people nearby spontaneously kept a respectful distance from him and Duan Qiong. The empty space around them attracted even more attention. Yi Futian was surprised that people in the capital city of the Shangqing continent would know about him. He assumed that it was because he looked at the sacred remains on the Tsengyuan continent. Rumor has it that you and Muyunlan both entered the relic on the Tsengyuan continent. You have seen the sacred remains in the divine casket too, right? Someone asked Yi Futian. Yes, I did. Yi Futian nodded and replied. Yi Futian's confirmation dispelled some people's fears. Both Yi Futian and Muyunlan had seen the sacred remains in the divine casket and only suffered minor injuries. The previous Renhuang must be blinded due to lesser strength. As scary as the sacred remains seemed to be, they were somewhat convinced that they wouldn't completely lose their sight if they gave it a try. What do you think of the sacred remains of Xinjiao the Great Emperor? The same person asked again. It can't be seen. Yi Futian raised his head and answered calmly. It can't be seen? Everyone was perplexed. Yi Futian had seen it, so had Muyunlan. Why did he say it couldn't be seen? Do you mean that we can't go to look at it? Someone asked for clarification. If you ask for my opinion, I think the sacred remains can't be seen. The domain chief also reminded us and issued a ban. Yi Futian replied in a flat voice. It was not his problem how they interpreted his response. So will you go to see it again? One person asked. Yes, I will. Yi Futian nodded and said. A murmur of surprise passed through the crowd. Yi Futian told them that the sacred remains couldn't be seen. Then he confirmed that he would go to look at it again. What did he mean? Was he implying that all the other cultivators were inferior to him? The master cultivators also shifted their eyes to Yi Futian. One middle-aged man spoke loudly. What an impressive answer from the famous cultivator from Four Corner Village. You certainly live up to your reputation. Yi Futian clearly sensed a strong vibration nearby when the man was speaking. Startled, he turned around to look for the energy source. Much to his surprise, Blind Tai was facing the middle-aged man while unleashing formidable power from his body. Blind Tai had always been composed and quiet ever since Yi Futian met him. After he lost his vision, he was the blacksmith in the village for many years while cultivating his temper and spirit. Blind Tai's strong reaction prompted Yi Futian to check out the middle-aged man. Blind Tai lost both his sight and trust in people from the outer realms because he was betrayed by a friend who also stole the divine technique from him decades ago. The middle-aged man seemed to possess tremendous power. Yi Futian assumed that he was the one who blinded Blind Tai. Yi Futian had been inquiring about Blind Tai's story in Four Corner Village. He learned which top force betrayed Blind Tai and stole the divine technique in the past. There was a supergroup called the Demon Cloud Clan in the lower third heavens of the Nine Heavens. The Demon Cloud Clan had a relatively short history compared to other sizable groups in the Shangqing domain. It didn't rise to power on account of a rich heritage. Instead, it was established and developed solely by one extraordinary and domineering cultivator, the Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan. The Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan had cultivated for a long time and possessed astonishing power. Although the Demon Cloud Clan was based in the lower third heavens, many people believed that the Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan was already in the same league as the master cultivators in the middle third heavens. On top of that, the cultivators from the Demon Cloud Clan were exceptionally ambitious and forceful. As a result, the group had advanced and expanded rapidly. The current generation was led by Embark, the eldest son of the Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan. He was bestowed with outstanding natural talent and had become an intimidating cultivator. Many people believe that he might even surpass the Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan and achieve more in the future. Rumor had it that the Great Elder of the Demon Cloud Clan suddenly rose to prominence thanks to obtaining a divine item. It was also why Embark, his eldest son, was able to make breakthroughs again and again. The son had become more successful than the father. Although he was from the lower third heavens, Embark was one of the most noted cultivators in the Shangqing domain. He was an 8th order Renhuang with a perfect great path, and was only one step away from becoming a master cultivator. If Mo could manage to advance to the Ninth Order, the Demon Cloud clan would spring up and become one of the most influential forces in the Shangqing domain. They might even have enough prestige to compete with the top forces in the upper third heavens. Emoku was also famous for his relationship with Blind Tai from Four Corner Village. Back in the day, they traveled through the Shangqing domain together like close brothers. Both of them were extraordinary cultivators who were well sought after. However, Emoku betrayed Blind Tai later. Not only did he steal Blind Tai's divine technique, but he also blinded and almost killed him. The news came as a bombshell at that time. Many people despised the Demon Cloud clan for their ruthless behaviors and unscrupulous means to get ahead. The groups in the upper 9 heavens also stayed away from the Demon Cloud clan. That being said, everyone had to admit that the Demon Cloud clan was growing stronger and stronger owing to their sheer brutality and wild ambition. They were probably aiming at the upper 3rd heavens. As soon as he sensed the rage emanating from Blind Tai, Futian figured out the identity of the middle-aged man in front of him. This man must be Emoku, the eldest son of the great elder of the Demon Cloud clan and the culprit who betrayed and disabled Blind Tai. Futian raised his head to stare at Emoku and said, "I will keep studying the inside of the divine casket. If you ask me again whether the sacred remains should be seen, my answer will remain the same. It's not my business if you look at it or not. You will know once you have seen it yourself. There is no need to ask me if your mind is settled already. Look at it if you want, don't if you don't have the balls." The crowd was baffled by Futian's response. He sounded extremely arrogant, and it was hard to tell in which direction he was pushing. Should the others look at the sacred remains or not? Based on what he said to Emoku, he seemed to be goading Emoku. Emoku was not an average cultivator. Nowadays, he was a wunderkind who was almost unrivaled among his peers in the Shangqing domain. Of course, Emoku wouldn't fall into Futian's trap so easily. He slowly turned his eyes to Blind Tai and said, "It's been a long time since I saw you last." Blind Tai lifted his chin to face Emoku. Even though he couldn't see, Emoku's face had been imprinted on his mind. How could he ever forget what Emoku looked like? He calmed down a lot, surprisingly. Although he still seemed stern and hostile, he regained his composure and didn't rush to action when facing his archenemy. "I heard that you made a lot of progress after you went back to the village. I didn't go to Four Corner Village with everyone else last time because I know you don't want to see me. Nevertheless, I was still happy for you when I heard the news about you," Emoku continued. He spoke as though they were still good friends who wished each other the best. "How happy are you?" Blind Tai asked in a flat voice. It was impossible to detect his emotion from his tone. "I'm genuinely happy for you," Emoku said. "At least at one point, we were brothers who went through thick and thin together." "Brothers?" A mocking smile crept onto Blind Tai's face. They were good brothers. Indeed. He only fell for a so-called brother like Emoku because he was naive and over-trusting when he first left the village. So many years have passed. Sometimes I also feel guilty for doing you wrong and letting you down in the past. However, since Four Corner Village has rejoined the rest of the world, we can let go of the bad blood and become friends again like in the old days. The Demon Cloud clan can be an ally for Four Corner Village as well," Emoku said. "So that we can be betrayed by you one more time?" Blind Tai said. "Your strength has increased for sure. But I'm more surprised that you are even more shameless now." Emoku stared at Blind Tai in silence for a short moment. Then he shifted his attention to Futian and said, "This young man from your village is much more arrogant than you when you first left the village." "He is better than me," Blind Tai replied. "Of course, he is far better than you, too, in every aspect." Blind Tai held Futian in high regard not only because of Futian's cultivation level but also for his character. Futian was far superior to Emoku and would never double-cross Blind Tai. "Is that so? I'm surprised that even you would praise him with such enthusiasm. No wonder he became so famous in such a short time. The entire Shangqing domain knows of his name by now." Emoku cracked a mirthless smile and took a deep look at Futian. After that, he turned around and walked toward the divine casket. His eyes sparkled with dark and golden demonic light. It seemed as if he had a pair of frightening demonic eyes. Embark took a few steps forward to approach the divine casket. Then he lowered his head and looked in its direction with a grave face. Although he criticized Futian for being arrogant, he was well aware of the danger posed by the sacred remains. Lan was on a par with Embark, if not better. Yet even he bled from his eyes after one peek and was convinced that the sacred remains shouldn't be desecrated. How could Embark underestimate the power of the sacred remains? The terrifying black demonic light burst out of the demonic eyes. However, everything was annihilated when the ancient characters hit Embark's eyes. The runes bludgeoned into his head as though he was defenseless prey. Bang! He didn't dare to look for one more second. He protected his body with great demonic might and jumped back with all possible haste. He didn't cover his eyes as Lan did. Blood streamed from the tightly closed demonic eyes. He looked like a ghastly Azura. The sacred remains couldn't be seen. Futian was not wrong. The sacred remains shouldn't be seen indeed. Anyone who attempted to look at it would suffer such an outcome. Embark was no exception. Lan and Embark had been defeated. Two extraordinary Renhuangs were wounded like this. What would happen to other average cultivators if they tried to look at the sacred remains too? No one dared to imagine. Lan and Embark were already mighty, second only to the mighty figures. Embark's eyes recovered in a short time. He shot a glance at Futian after he opened his eyes. "Let's see how you will study the divine casket," Embark said to Futian. Everyone fixed their gaze on Futian. Futian claimed that he would look at the sacred remains in the divine casket again. What would happen to him when two of the best cultivators couldn't withstand the power of the sacred remains? Futian turned to Embark and replied, "Studying the divine casket is my business. It's not a performance for your benefit." Embark disregarded Futian's response and said, "It's all the same." "Of course they are not the same. I'm not interested in looking at it yet," Futian replied. He had no reason to be polite to Blind Tai's enemy. Embark lowered his head and stared at Futian as a formless pressure was unleashed from his body and enveloped Futian. But Futian stared right back at him without any inhibition. His deep eyes were colored with some disdain and aloofness. No matter how powerful Embark's level of cultivation was, the things he did would not earn him any respect. Instead, they only made others despise him. An invisible storm appeared within the space. Behind Futian, Blind Tai took a step forward, and a tremendous amount of great path power surged out of him and headed straight for the space. It clashed with the authoritative pressure that Embark had unleashed and actually transformed into this invisible storm, which created a suffocating feeling in this place. "Since you do not dare to look, then do not speak so boastfully." Just then, a voice came from afar. It sounded rather cold and distant, carrying a tinge of disdain. Everyone looked at where the voice came from to see a group of elegant-looking people. They were all in white, and their aura was intense, especially the leader of the group. He was overwhelmingly valiant-looking, particularly those eyes of his. His eyes didn't seem to look like the eyes of the other people, and they exuded an otherworldly beauty. "Cultivators from the palace of the illusory god," someone among the crowd muttered in a low voice. "That's Bai Yan from the palace of the illusory god." In no time, the leader of the group was quickly recognized as one of the palace of the illusory god's best disciples, Bai Yan. He was a direct disciple of the current illusory god, a level 6 perfect great path cultivator. His prowess was extraordinary, and he killed without leaving any traces. One look from him was enough to kill. "Palace of the illusory god!" Futian said this in his heart. Another enemy of Four Corner Village had appeared. When Four Corner Village was going through that change, none of the cultivators from the Demon Cloud nor the Palace of the Illusory God had appeared. These two factions of power had the deepest feud with Four Corner Village, and the divine techniques of Four Corner Village had gone to these two factions. Someone from the palace of the illusory god had once taken the eye of reincarnation from the one who was to inherit the divine techniques of Four Corner Village and put it into his own eye instead. That way, he robbed Four Corner Village of its divine techniques in this terribly cruel fashion. After Futian thought about how Four Corner Village would have passed the divine techniques on, he guessed that the cultivator who got his eyes dug out by the palace of the illusory god was very likely to be connected to Duo Yu and was likely a senior related to Duo Yu by blood. That's why Duo Yu could be awakened and inherit the eye of reincarnation. "If you dare, you can try it yourself," said Futian very nonchalantly. Bai Yen spun around and looked toward Futian. It took only an instant for Futian to see a pair of terrifying eyes. A pair of eyes that could bring a person into an illusionary world. That pair of eyes seemed to be filled with divine light, which soon turned into a huge whirlpool that sucked in one's consciousness. He didn't say anything, and it took only one look at Futian to bring Futian into his world of eye sorcery. When everyone else saw Bai Yen turn around, as well as the divine light flowing in his gaze, they immediately understood that Bai Yen had used his eye sorcery on Futian. Futian's body appeared within the realm of the eye sorcery. An enormous shadow appeared near his body like a god of sorts. It held a long spear in its hand and was aiming it towards Futian's body. This deity seemed impossible to fend off, as it held the ultimate authority within the world of its eye sorcery. Boom! The terrifying deity brought its divine spear down as it made a stab at Futian's body. In that instant, Futian seemed especially minuscule. The spear of the deity came right down onto Futian's body, but instead of going through Futian, it was blocked from doing so. A surprised voice came out from the emptiness as the divine light around Futian started flowing, and he looked into the emptiness within the illusionary realm. He said, "You wanted to try using an illusory method like eye sorcery to control my consciousness at your level of cultivation? You're not good enough." This voice resounded in the outside world as well because it had come out from Futian's own mouth. Even though everyone could see that the two men were standing there without moving, they knew they had already started fighting. "Is that so?" Bai Yen said icily. The divine light in his eyes became even more terrifying as they shot straight towards Futian's body. Many of them could sense an invisible force covering Futian. Inside the world of the eye sorcery, Futian continued standing there. A frightening windstorm started blowing towards him. It twisted and destroyed the space he was in as it threatened to swallow him as well. This was a true storm that attacked the spirit, and there was nowhere to hide in the space of the eye sorcery. That actual spiritual windstorm was like a knife that cut through the space as it hit Futian's body, making him feel like he had been stabbed. But his body seemed to be protected by divine light as it stood there and looked towards the outside. Outside, Futian's gaze had also become incredibly sharp as it cut through all emptiness, and rushed straight into the other person's eye of reincarnation. In that instant, Bai Yen felt as if a terrifyingly sharp sword had stabbed right into his consciousness. This was eye sorcery. Futian was also good at eye sorcery. Two frightening gazes collided, and a terrifying illusion appeared between their bodies. It was as if it was the image of the fight between their eye sorcery attacks. Boom! A chilly wind flew right into Bai Yan's eye, making him feel an extreme coldness that nearly stopped his thoughts from being able to move and threatened to freeze his very soul. Right there and then, Bai Yan wanted to stop using his eye sorcery, only to find that the divine light that shot out from Futian's eyes had gone right into his consciousness. Within that illusion, everyone around them saw the frosty moon. They saw the incredibly gorgeous divine sword and the impossibly invincible long spear. A terrifying amount of great path divine light turned the tables as it enveloped all of Bai Yan's body within itself. Futian's eyes became even more terrifying to look at, and everyone else's heart was palpitating. Was Futian actually using eye sorcery to fight Bai Yan? Bai Yan's expression was clearly changing. It looked like he was struggling and wanted to get out of this fight, but the divine light had fully enveloped his body. He seemed to be completely entrenched inside and had no way of getting out. This really puzzled a lot of people. Bai Yan's best technique was eye sorcery, but the technique he was best at was now being attacked by the same thing. Worse still, He hadn't gained any advantage, and it wasn't wrong to say that he was actually losing now. "How dare you use the eye sorcery technique that you stole from someone else in front of me?" spat Yi Futian. He took a step forward. With a loud explosion, Bai Yan's body flew backward. His face was deathly pale, and fresh blood seeped from his eyes. My goodness! Everyone felt their hearts tremble when they saw this scene. Yi Futian's eyes slowly regained normalcy, but the way he looked at Bai Yan was still filled with nothing but disdain. Bai Yan's bleeding eyes opened to stare at Yi Futian. His face was as white as a sheet. This was the greatest humiliation he had ever suffered. He had used his best technique to attack Yi Futian, but had been humiliated in return. He had literally asked for it. My goodness, is he really that powerful? All the cultivators thought as they all looked at Yi Futian. They had heard some rumors about how powerful Yi Futian was, but this was the first time they had watched him fight. Even the cultivators from those highly acclaimed factions of power were surprised. Yi Futian had used eye sorcery to defeat Bai Yan, an expert in the eye sorcery. What sorcery was this? They now looked at Yi Futian more respectfully than before. Few in the Shangqing domain could compare to someone with such gifting. Even the strongest fighters from the ancient royal family of Duan had been thoroughly thrashed by him and had admitted defeat. And now, Bai Yan had been soundly defeated by eye sorcery. Yi Futian didn't look at Bai Yan anymore and just walked towards where the divine casket was. Everyone's eyes followed his movement as he walked past them. What would happen when Yi Futian looked at the ancient body lying in the divine casket? Chapter 2165, You'd get used to it after a few times. Rumor had it that Yi Futian had looked into the divine casket back at San Yuan continent, while Muyun Lan could only watch on from the side. And now, they were going to witness this for themselves. Both Muyun Lan and Mo's eyes started bleeding when they looked upon the body. Was Yi Futian really able to look at the body without getting injured? They watched as that man with white hair continued to walk toward where the divine casket was. A terrifying aura of light shone in his eyes because those eyes of his seemed to be hiding true divine light within them. He had tried this several times when he was at San Yuan continent, so he knew how terrifying this corpse could be. He also knew how he could minimize the force that surged out of it. He walked all the way to one corner of the casket and took a glance into the casket. With just that one glance, he witnessed that incredible scene yet again. The body of Xinjiao the great emperor had transformed into countless ancient inscriptions, and those inscriptions went right into his eyes and into his consciousness, causing his body to tremble slightly. Those beams of light had not only entered his eyes, but that frightening divine light had also enveloped all of Yi Futian's body. It was as if those inscriptions were printed directly onto his body. He's really done it! Everyone felt their hearts shudder when they saw this scene. They knew that Yi Futian must have looked upon the body inside the casket, otherwise, this amazing scene would not have happened. However, he did not end up getting thrown backward, and his eyes did not bleed. The inscriptions within the casket were even projected onto his body. This made a lot of them wonder, isn't a body lying within that divine casket? Where did these inscriptions come from? Were great and talented people like Muyun Lan and Mo unable to even glance at the inside of the casket because of these inscriptions? Then, how was Yi Futian able to do this? Woom! Just then, they watched as Yi Futian's body was thrown backward, and his eyes shut fast. Countless eyes were on him right now, so the vast space they were in seemed rather quiet. After a few moments, Yi Futian's eyes finally opened again. Tiny capillaries in his eyes had burst, and it was clear that it had been painful for him to resist the force from the casket earlier. His eyes had undergone a tremendous amount of pressure, but he managed to hang in there and look in a few more times. Muyun Lan and Mo had been unable to do it, but Yi Futian, who was only a level 5 Rehuang, had managed it. This made many of them gasp. Rumors didn't appear out of thin air. They had heard a lot about Yi Futian before this, and how he was truly as capable as his fame claimed him to be. His gifts and potential were astonishing, and he was definitely no less powerful than Muyun Lan or Mo. What do you think now? Someone in the crowd looked up at Mo and asked. It was Fang Huan from Four Corner Village. He knew everything about what Emoku and the demon cloud had done. As a cultivator from the village, Fan Huan also viewed Emoku as an enemy. Before this, all these cultivators threatened Futian, and many of them had thought too highly of themselves. They thought that Futian was being arrogant, and wasn't truly as powerful as the rumors claimed he was. But how about now? Emoku looked down at Fan Huan. His aloof gaze carried some frostiness. He had been rather surprised, too, and didn't think that Futian would have been capable of this. It seemed like this white-haired young man who had stormed the ancient royal family of Duan and gained the recognition of Four Corner Village was not simple at all. "He's really not bad," replied Emoku. After that, he looked towards Futian and asked, "How did you do that?" He had looked into the divine casket before too, and he knew what was going on in there. One glance had been enough to strike fear in his heart till today. Even though he still wanted to look in, his heart was extremely wary. So how did that Futian actually do it? Futian turned to look at Emoku and said, "You'd get used to it after a few times. Do you want to come and try?" Everyone looked oddly at Futian. Why did his words sound so fake? If one looked into the divine casket a few more times, you'd get used to it? Was this fellow trying to fool Emoku? Emoku looked at Futian rather doubtfully as well. After a few times? His heart still felt fearful after just that one glance into the casket. Would he really become used to it if he tried looking again? If that was the case, then why didn't Myunlan try again? "Are you trying to fool me?" asked Emoku as he stared at Futian. He was sure there was something special about Futian. Since he could do something that neither himself nor Myunlan had been able to, there must be something about him that the two of them didn't have, allowing him to gaze into the casket. "Before this, you asked me a question and refused to believe my answer. Now you're asking me a question again, and you still don't want to take my word for it. In that case, why bother asking me?" retorted Futian. Emoku kept his eye on Futian as a cold glint flashed in his eyes. If not for the fact that he was a little wary today, he would have unleashed an attack on Futian to force him to say how he had done it. But cultivators from both Four Corner Village and the ancient royal family of Duan were here. Also, they were right outside the domain chief's manor. Since there was probably nothing he could do, he decided not to attack. "If you're not going to look at it, then I'm going to continue looking," said Futian to Emoku before going back towards that same upper corner of the divine casket again. At this moment, countless eyes were frozen as they stared at Futian in shock. Was he serious? Was it true that he was getting used to it after taking a few more looks, as he said earlier? Emoku had an equally puzzled look on his face when he watched Futian. Futian was really using his own actions to prove his point? Before this, Futian had already proved himself with his own actions. He said that he could look into the casket, and he really did it. Countless eyes watched as Futian stood diagonally above the casket and looked in. Again, it only took one glance for light to envelope him, and for that gorgeous divine light to shoot out at Futian. "He's doing it again." Chenny shook his head as he looked at Futian. He understood this fellow now. Futian went all out no matter what and didn't seem to understand the concept of staying low-key. So many people were here right now, and many of them would be watching him closely. Chinny was right. Many cultivators from the Shangqing domain and other top factions of power were all here. Some had walked over, while some remained in the shadows. But regardless of where they were, they all looked towards that white-haired person in the air. There was even a group of people standing in the air inside the domain chief's manor. They, too, looked at Futian's body. But actually, Futian wasn't trying to attract attention. He didn't want to miss such an opportunity. Back in the Tsangyuan continent, he had wanted to take a few more looks at this casket so that he could comprehend the secrets within. But it had been taken away, and there was nothing he could do about it. This left him feeling empty and disappointed. So when Duan Qiong suggested coming here, he agreed to it without hesitation and immediately came out to view the body in the casket. He knew that he didn't have much more time to do this, and he had already gained some enlightenment from looking at the corpse. As everyone else continued to watch, Futian looked into the casket several more times. In fact, the amount of time he could spend looking increased the more times he tried to take a look. It was as if what he said earlier was right, one could really get used to it after a few times. Thus, the hesitant and indecisive Emoku from before decided to take a step forward again. It seemed as if he believed what Futian said and wanted to try again. Everyone was puzzled by what Emoku was doing. He walked up and took a look at the sacred remains in the divine casket. Emoku growled after taking a single look. His body was sent reeling, and blood dripped from his eyes again. The scene was harrowing. The hell! Everyone around looked at Futian, who was standing in front. We'd get used to it after taking several looks. How are we supposed to keep looking like that? They wondered. Emoku had only taken a look on his second try, and his eyes were still filled with blood. How are we supposed to keep looking? We will probably go blind if we look one more time, let alone several. This is terrible, they thought. It was then that all of them realized that Futian was toying with Emoku. There was no way one could get used to it just by looking more. Yet Emoku actually believed those ridiculous claims of his. Futian had tried this personally, taking repeated looks at the sacred remains. It was indeed as he had put it, he eventually got used to it. Emoku would not have been duped otherwise. Emoku opened his eyes moments later, and the look in his eyes was filled with cold, killing intent. He saw how effortless and graceful Blind Tai and Futian had behaved before. Yet being repeatedly fooled by Futian in front of everyone was something that someone of his status could hardly stomach. It was true embarrassment. One could easily imagine his mood at that moment. Formless power emanated from Emoku. Someone was seen shooting into the sky. It was none other than Blind Tai. Blind Tai had also decided to release a powerful aura, which shrouded over Emoku. Seemingly, he was trying to remind Emoku to remember his place. Emoku sensed that aura and shot a look at Blind Tai, yet his eyes were still filled with killing intent. There was still blood beneath his eyes, making him look rather eerie. There are things that one is not worthy of looking at, and there is nothing that one can do to change it. It's not like all those years ago, where one could take whatever one wished, Blind Tai said, jabbing at Emoku being unworthy of looking at the sacred remains. You never changed, did you? Still as blunt with your words as ever, Emoku said plainly. If I were unworthy of looking at the divine casket, isn't that the same as saying that no cultivator in the Shangqing domain would be worthy of doing so? While my words do not sound pleasant, it is the truth. It is what it is, and I myself am not worthy of doing so either. Is there any reason for me to sugarcoat it? Blind Tai replied. He had, of course, gotten to know Emoku better after what had happened all those years ago, that the man he once called a brother was someone who would get what he wanted by any means necessary. What he said earlier was deliberately worded to provoke him, but given that his conscience was clear, he didn't mind at all. While what Blind Tai said didn't sound nice, everyone who was present was a cultivator at the Ruhuang Plain, and some were indeed very, very powerful. As such, they knew that Blind Tai was telling the truth. These were not just any sacred remains but the remains of Xinjiao the great emperor, a great emperor and a god of ancient times. If they were not allowed to look at it, that would only mean that they were indeed not worthy. There was nothing to be ashamed about. Emoku moved his sight away from Blind Tai and turned to Futian. He walked up to Futian after seeing the other man was about to retreat, shrouding massive pressure over Futian, placing a lockdown on the space Futian occupied. He coldly said, "If you're already used to it, why not take a few more glances instead of retreating?" The divine light around Futian was terrifying enough that Emoku closed his eyes all of a sudden, about to retreat, yet he was prevented from doing so by the powers of the Great Path. Boom! He emitted a huge pressure, which he then withdrew. Blind Tai attacked after sensing what was happening. He brought down a divine hammer from above, viciously aiming at Emoku. Emoku raised his hand and grabbed outward. A massive hand took hold of the specter of that divine hammer, and the mighty pressure of the Great Path swept all over the place, causing a harrowing storm below as it traveled downwards, causing many to reel from the shock right away. "What are you two doing outside the domain chief's manor?" A voice came from the domain chief's manor. The voice was heard before the man was seen. A group of people then walked out of the domain chief's manor and emerged in the air, looking at Emoka and Blind Tai fighting each other. Emoka pulled his hand back, and Blind Tai stopped attacking as well. Futian retreated and glanced at Emoka. There were young men and women, as well as powerful elders that had just emerged. They concealed their powers. Also, they needed to stand in midair in order to cast a faint pressure over everyone. The leader was a middle-aged man who was the son of the domain chief's manor of Shangqing Domain, Zhou Muhuang. He could also be called the young master of the domain chief's manor. His powers were towering, and he was already one of the most powerful cultivators to be found in the Shangqing domain. He was at level 9 of the Great Path. Even the titans among the top-notch cultivation forces wouldn't have many among them capable of winning against Zhou Muhuang. The father and son of the Shangqing domain were both standing at the very pinnacle. Of course, given that even Zhou Muhuang himself had trained for over 100 years, the chief was definitely much older. He was someone of supreme power among those of the previous generation. However, due to Zhou Muhuang having unparalleled training, he appeared rather young, around 40. In the Shangqing domain, few dared to be disrespectful to that young master. This was due to his status and because his powers were more than enough to put a great many powerful fighters in the domain in their place. "Greetings, young master," many greeted. Those with weaker powers had even bowed to Zhou Muhuang. The man stood where he was and scanned the crowd before saying, "At ease, everyone. This divine casket was brought here from the Tsingyuan continent. It is unimaginably mystical yet very dangerous. That was why my father forbade anyone from looking at it. But if any of you would like to take a look, the domain chief's manor won't stop you. However, the consequences are all yours. You all are the best that the Shangqing domain has to offer. Anybody who would like to learn about the divine casket is welcome to do so. There is simply no need for fights." Zhou Muhuang elaborated. Although both Emoka and Blind Tai were powerful cultivators and of advanced age themselves, if one were to really go about counting, they would probably be deemed juniors to Zhou Muhuang, especially in the case of Blind Tai. Blind Tai was probably the youngest and was probably far younger than Zhou Muhuang. As such, it was only natural for Zhou Muhuang's words to carry immense weight. "Forgive us for our impulsiveness, Muhuang," Emoka cupped his hands and said. Despite his status, he still had nothing to brag about before Zhou Muhuang. "Right." Zhou Muhuang nodded. "My father invited cultivators from all over, and we would not wish to see any altercations break out. Should there be any personal feud among you, I'd advise you to try not to act on them here. With you being the one giving the word, I shall do as you say, Muhuang," Emoka replied, and Blind Tai nodded. Zhou Muhuang nodded and turned his eyes back to Futian. "Your reputation precedes you, Emperor Yi. You're indeed as dashing as you are reputed to be." Everyone was stunned. Zhou Muhuang was of such prestigious standing that he could afford to ignore Emoka and Blind Tai. He did not need to be courteous, even to the many titans from the many cultivation forces out there. Yet he seemed to have taken a liking to Futian very much, complimenting the man as he did. "Zhou Muhuang, a young master of the domain chief's manor of Shangqing domain. Level 9, perfection in Great Path." Futian looked at the middle-aged man and recalled Duan Qiong's introduction. According to Duan Qiong, not even her father, Duan Tianxiong, would beat Zhou Muhuang. Furthermore, one could tell just how ambitious he was from his name alone. Zhou Muhuang. Just how many expectations had his father piled on his son? Was he hoping for his son to become the great emperor then? Futian had been in 2 domains before, the Donghua domain and the Shangqing domain. The ones from the domain chief's manor were all mighty. There were Ning Yuan and Ning Hua from Donghua domain, and both were mighty beings. The way Futian saw it, those of the domain chief's manor who ruled over the 18 domains in Donghuang the Great's stead were all supreme beings in their own right. All of them were titans, and the powers of such people were every bit on par with those who served the great imperial palace directly. Said titans could actually be more powerful instead. It would seem that the establishment of the domain chief's manor reigning over the 18 domains was anything but simple. The years in which Dong Wang the Great ruled over the divine prefectures were not all that long. The nobles of the divine prefectures carved up their own territories, and powerful beings were aplenty. Dong Wang the Great would naturally need to enlist the help of those who were of supreme powers, to begin with, if he were to rule over the divine prefectures. That was probably how the domain chief's manors of the 18 domains came about. They weren't necessarily considered closed ones of Dong Wang the Great. You speak too highly of me, senior. Yi Futian bowed slightly. Despite being the young master, he was nonetheless Yi Futian's senior, so there was nothing wrong for him to address him as such. I know a thing or two about your exploits. You hail from Donghua Domain, then went to Four Corner Village. You've gotten acquainted with the ancient royal family of Duan. You are nothing less than extraordinary. It is a pity that Ningyuan of the Donghua Domain's domain chief's manor overlooked your brilliance, wanting to actually kill someone of your caliber. I wonder what was he thinking? Zhou Muhuang then said to Yi Futian. Yi Futian, if you intend to train in the domain chief's manor of Shangqing Manor, you'd be welcome to do so by both my father and me. Everyone was stunned upon hearing what Zhou Muhuang just said. The first thing he did after coming outside was try to get Yi Futian to his side. He had actually invited him to train in the domain chief's manor. One could tell that he was incredibly impressed with Yi Futian and wanted to capitalize on this opportunity. Furthermore, he was totally unfazed by the powers at Donghua Domain and voiced Ningyuan's mistakes just like that. One could tell that the domain chief's manors were hardly acquainted with each other and left each to their own devices. So long as Yi Futian was willing to agree to join the domain chief's manor, he would definitely be able to rise to greater heights in terms of status. By then, not even those from the Donghua Domain could easily do anything against him. Yi Futian was rather surprised by the treatment. This treatment was rather ironic given that he had intended to train in the domain chief's manor back at the Donghua Domain. Instead, it was he had been set up and hunted instead. When he had lost all such intentions, those of the domain chief's manor of the Shangqing Domain extended their invitation instead. However, he was no longer in a state suitable for doing so. He had joined Four Corner Village prior and was already one of them. He was not about to abandon the village for the domain chief's manor. I'm sorry, senior. I've joined Four Corner Village, and it would be unsuitable for me to train in the domain chief's manor. I'm afraid that I have no choice but to pass up the offer. Truly, I beg for your forgiveness, Yi Futian replied. Blind Tai, Fang Huan, and the others nodded in silence. Those from the village had indeed been right about Yi Futian. He would have received more benefits, and great ones at that, if he were to choose the domain chief's manor over the village. However, given that he had become one of the cultivators of the Four Corner Village, and the village had decided to train openly in the world, that itself would then make the village one of the titans in the Shangqing Domain. Given the circumstances, he couldn't join either without renouncing membership of the other. If the village were to remain closed to the world, it wouldn't have been a problem. Zhou Muhuang heard what Yi Futian said and nodded. I understand. The way the others behind Yi Futian looked at him suggested that they were having other thoughts. It was indeed quite a pity for Yi Futian to pass up such an opportunity, as Yi Futian was someone with such superb talent that it was incredibly possible for him to become a titan on his own. However, he would most definitely achieve success a lot more quickly if he were to train in the domain chief's manor. Most importantly, Yi Futian had a lot of enemies. The way they saw it, there were just too many superb geniuses perishing on their way to greatness. If Yi Futian were able to train in the domain chief's manor and, as such, gain the domain chief of the Shangqing Domain's protection, he would have been at considerably lower risk. Yet he chose to remain with the Four Corner Village instead. Zhou Muhuang looked up at the crowd and said, A lot of all of you present today are the best that the Shangqing Domain has to offer. It would be impossible for you not to look at the divine casket. Anyone who wishes to take a look, please do not get in the way of the others. Whether or not any of you can gain something from it or not is entirely up to you. Everyone nodded. There was nothing else the others could say, given that Zhou Muhuang had spoken. Zhou Muhuang was then seen walking up to the divine casket at that moment, taking a look inside. Massive fluctuations of the great path rumbled around him from him taking just a single look. Yet, that pair of frightening eyes continued to look into the divine casket. It took him quite a while to close his eyes and back away. All who saw what happened were in awe, deeming that he had indeed lived up to his prestige of being among the strongest. While Zhou Muhuang's training was only one level higher than Muyunlan and Mo, the difference of just one level was, in itself, a chasm. No matter how superb said people were, they could still never win, even if they were to join hands in the face of Zhou Muhuang. So, this is what those at great emperor level are like, Zhou Muhuang mumbled to himself. His aura was flighty, making him feel like someone who was above mortals. He could tell that those ancient symbols seemed like that they were beyond what people knew to be the Great Path. It could even be said that those were in the path that great Emperor Xinjia himself created. With those symbols carved within his body, that body itself had become a manifestation of the path. Someone was walking to Zhou Muhuang's side at that moment. That woman had a superb appearance, and her bearing was extremely elegant. It felt like she was a goddess that had descended to the mortal realm. The woman was none other than Zhou Muhuang's sister, Zhou Lingxi. Zhou Lingxi took a look at her brother, who then told her, "Be very careful if you're about to look. The level great Emperor Xinjia reached all those years ago is already somewhere we mere mortals cannot comprehend. All powers that we're versed in are utterly useless before him. Be prepared if you really want to take a look." "I want to take a look," Zhou Lingxi answered. Insistence was seen in her eyes. She deemed herself capable of bearing whatever cost it could have incurred, and she would never rest until she got to look at the sacred remains with her own eyes. "All right then." Zhou Muhuang nodded and didn't stop Zhou Lingxi. Zhou Lingxi went up, and she shrouded herself with divine light, which made her look even more spiritual and mystical. That princess from the domain chief's manor was, too, a supreme genius. She had superb cultivation talents, and was at perfection at level 6. One more step, and she could already make a step into high-level Renhuang. One could imagine just how terrifying the powers the domain chief's manor would command by then. Other than the domain chief himself, it was obvious that even his children were people who were a cut above the rest. Zhou Lingxi went up to the divine casket and took a look inside. There was no miracle happening. Despite being a princess of the domain chief's manor, her eyes were bloodied, and her aura wavered from a single look. She was sent reeling back as blood poured all over her face. She covered her face with her hands and looked in very, very bad shape. Many felt pity that a female Renhuang was in such a pitiful state. Zhou Muhuang came to his side without saying anything. Zhou Lingxi took a while before her state gradually steadied. She moved her hands away, and her eyes remained bloodshot even then. This gave her a tinge of withering beauty. She looked like she was some beautiful woman who was about to pass away. "Are you all right?" Zhou Muhuang asked. "I'm fine." Zhou Lingxi shook her head slightly. Slivers of watery mist appeared, and she wiped the blood off of her face. Her eyes remained slightly bloodshot still, making it obvious that one look before had greatly damaged her eyes. She was only at level 6, after all. This put her beneath the likes of Muyunlan and Mo. Many murmured among themselves, looking like they were seriously discussing something. Many cast impressed looks at Futian. They could tell from what happened with Zhou Lingxi when she looked at the divine casket how rare someone like Futian actually was. When he was being compared to Muyunlan and Mo, he had been able to do better than they had. Zhou Lingxi, too, was at a level higher than Futian, and everyone was able to see what happened to her. Zhou Lingxi turned her eyes around to look at Futian. She walked up gracefully to him, which caused him to wear a puzzled expression. Zhou Lingxi then came to Futian's side, and she actually bowed to him. He raised his eyebrows slightly and asked, "What warranted that, Princess Lingxi?" "I'd like to ask you something, Sir Yi," Zhou Lingxi said. Futian then replied, "Please, Princess Lingxi, just tell me what you would like to know. I was unable to take the strain after just taking one look inside the divine casket, which enabled me to learn what was so extraordinary about you, Sir Yi. However, I was more or less able to tell what was inside the divine casket. I'd like to know how you prevented yourself from being injured by the sacred remains inside. Zhou Lingxi asked, and many were wearing curious looks. As she was not the only one who wanted to know, everyone around was curious as well. Amoka had, too, asked before, but Yi Futian never wanted to say anything. However, given that it was the princess of the domain chief's manor asking for his advice after taking such damage, Yi Futian simply couldn't refuse. Yi Futian looked at the princess, and he indeed was finding it difficult to refuse to answer. However, the sacred remains which he was able to gaze on were more complex as far as the secrets of the world tree were concerned, which meant that he could never tell her the whole truth. He had even wondered if the princess was actually asking for his guidance, or if she was just testing him. It seemed that, eventually, it would be more likely that the former was true, given that she had looked in the coffin herself and had been severely damaged because of that. Furthermore, be it the domain chief's manor itself, or the Zhou siblings, they had all been very courteous with him. If it is something that you find inconvenient to voice, Sir Yi, then please forgive my rudeness. Zhou Lingxi looked at Yi Futian before bowing again. It's not actually all that inconvenient. It was just that the very reason why I could gaze upon the remains is due to something particular about my training. Furthermore, I experienced some surreal encounters back in the Donghua domain that allows me to resist such effects to a degree. However, they will not do you much good, Princess, Yi Futian answered. I see. Zhou Lingxi nodded. It seems that I don't have the opportunity to learn by looking at the sacred remains then. Given that you have such an ability, Sir Yi, are you able to sense the will of the ancient gods from the sacred remains? Although Yi Futian was responding to Zhou Lingxi, this was only polite small talk. In reality, no one knew what he was actually doing. They could only guess. Perhaps it was because he had received the gift from the demon monarch in the Donghua domain back that he could block the great emperor's divine armor will. This is a rare opportunity indeed. If you come to some understanding, Emperor Yi, I would hate to miss out on it, said Emperor Zhou Mu with a smile. I understand, said Yi Futian with a nod. I will work hard and see if I can glean some ancient cultivation arts from the divine body. However, if I only get to look at it for a little bit, then that will be too short a time to learn much. The divine body is full of wonder, but it will be hard to get much out of it. The body of Xinjia the great emperor is indeed wonderful. We will see it together. If you have any doubts, Emperor Yi, you can find me in the domain chief's manor at any time, and we can discuss your feelings, said Emperor Zhou Mu. Thank you, Elder, said Yi Futian with a slight nod. Zhou Mu said no more to him. He turned to the crowd around them and said, If any of you want to come, you must take caution that you do not make any mistakes. If you do not have enough control, you should not try. Of course, if you think you do have enough control, you can come with Emperor Yi and try to seize this opportunity. Everyone nodded. Given Emperor Zhou Mu's lofty position, he naturally had the right to lecture them like this. On saying this, Emperor Zhou Mu turned and left, leading them towards the domain chief's manor. He turned his head and saw Zhou Lingxi still standing there. Lingxi, are you staying here, or are you returning to the manor? He asked. I will stay here and watch. You go on ahead, said Zhou Lingxi. All right. Emperor Zhou Mu nodded and did not linger any longer. Zhou Lingxi stood not far from Yi Futian, smiling at him and saying, I expect that you will be able to gain an understanding of the imperial will from the body of Xinjia the great emperor, Mr. Yi. You are too kind, Princess Lingxi, said Yi Futian with a smile and a nod. Among the crowd, Chen Yi and some of the others felt that this scene before them was quite strange. This Zhou Lingxi seemed quite close to Yi Futian. It is still essential to keep up appearances, murmured Chen Yi. Even in the Ruhuang plain, appearances still mattered. You don't understand, whispered Condor-sama, looking at Chen Yi with a bit of contempt. It was not surprising that Chen Yi had not understood. I don't understand? Sneered Chen Yi. What don't I understand? The boss has walked all this way on his own, under his own halo. How could you understand it? Said Condor-sama. What? Chen Yi looked at the condor as if it were an idiot. Even demons can flatter so shamelessly? Spring insects know nothing of ice. How can common people understand the world of masters? Said Condor-sama enigmatically. Shinny wanted to hit it, but there was no need for him to do it. The black-winged condor felt a cold will. It turned around and saw Xia Qingyuan looking at it coldly. It shrank back. She was murderous. At that moment, a soft, clear voice rang out. Of all the heroes, Emperor Yi is the only one who can observe the divine body. In that case, is he the most powerful of all the proud heroes of the Shangning domain? The clouds in the sky shifted as a group of figures descended. Many veiled women were pulling a carriage behind them. The chariot was very spacious, and behind a thin veil, there seemed to be a charming figure reclining, seeming almost insubstantial. Even looking through the thin curtain, she seemed to be exquisitely beautiful. The black-winged condor looked up and whispered, "Do you understand?" Condor-sama's expression was profound and mysterious. It was like he was in a divine trance. Qingyi's mouth twitched. He seemed to understand a bit now. Everyone's eyes were upon the carriage. If empresses were pulling the carriage, what kind of person could be inside? "It's someone from the palace of the illusory god," someone whispered. "It's her." The cultivators from the top powers narrowed their eyes. They already knew who was coming. This woman was an incredibly famous figure in the world of cultivators. And she was a bit eccentric. She had been born in the palace of the illusory god, but it was said that she had been kicked out when she was young due to an inter-family conflict. She had lived a hard life and experienced much suffering. However, she had managed to slay all the members of the family who had hurt her own family all by herself. This had caused a great stir when it happened, and many people had heard of it. But in the end, the palace of the illusory god had accepted her once again. This woman was called the goddess Jihuan by the world of cultivators. She had already cultivated up to the 9th tier, and although her great path was not perfect, her illusions were powerful. She could entice people towards any earthly desire and make them fall into a deep trance from which they could not pull themselves out of. Thus, she was called Goddess Jihuan. When she had dealt with her family's enemies, she had hurt them so badly that they no longer wished to live. "Careful, that is the Goddess Jihuan of the 9th tier. Her illusions are frighteningly powerful, and she is a tricky swordswoman. She is an eccentric of the palace of the illusory god," said Duan Qiong to Yi Futian telepathically. The palace of the illusory god and the ancient royal family of Duan were both great powers of the middle third heavens and had come into conflict many times. Thus, he understood them very well. He naturally knew of the goddess Jihuan. Yi Futian was a bit uncomfortable when he heard this. This goddess Jihuan seemed to be praising him, but her words had pushed him to the forefront of this storm. What he had done before had attracted a lot of attention. Now Goddess Jihuan had said that he was the most powerful of all the proud heroes of the Shangqing domain. A title like that was absolutely not a good thing. "You honor me too much, senior. The reason I can observe the divine body is due to the specialty of my cultivation. I would not dare call myself the most powerful. There are many other Renhuangs who are much stronger than me," Yi Futian called up into the sky. Although he knew her name, he did not call her goddess, opting for senior. Instead, laughter like that of a silver bell rang out. The woman descended into the air above Yi Futian, the curtain before her blowing in the wind. Everyone could faintly see a stunning figure lying within. Her eyes seemed able to enchant people's very souls. She smiled at Yi Futian. Just an ordinary glance from her seemed able to send one into a trance. She made it so that she was the only thing that Yi Futian could see. His consciousness was drawn into the carriage where he beheld her perfect, flawless form. This woman was no less beautiful than Zhou Lingxi, and she had a more concrete sense of charm about her. Her killing power was greater as well. Everyone appreciates beauty, and cultivators were no different. But they were able to control their appreciation of beauty and would not let their minds to affect it. This was especially true for Renhuan-level cultivators. They would certainly not sink to that level. Thus, her beauty was not that enticing for Yi Futian. "It hurts me to hear you call me that, Emperor Yi," said the goddess Jihuan softly. Even her voice seemed to have a mysterious charm to it that would make people fall into reveries. You are much older than me, senior, and you have cultivated to a much higher level. That is why I call you senior, to show you respect. Why would you say that I am hurting you? Said Futian casually, looking up at the figure in the sky. He was still calling her senior, and not goddess. Goddess Chihuan smiled and came out of the carriage, standing before it in the air, wearing a gorgeous red robe. She looked graceful and luxurious. In an instant, she transformed from an alluring woman into a noble empress, brimming with peerless elegance. In the instant that she changed her manner, many people would not even dare to look at her. Futian was surprised. This change had been so quick. She truly was a cultivator of the palace of the illusory god. If that is what you wish, Emperor Yi, then so be it, she said with a smile. Her noble atmosphere spread out as her gaze fell upon Futian. In an instant, her form seemed to enter into his mind. I have heard of your deeds, Emperor Yi, and I admire you greatly. I wish to become your friend, continued the goddess Chihuan, smiling. As her voice reached him, Futian seemed to enter another space, a world of illusion magic. In this world, there was only him and the goddess Chihuan. Your method of making friends is rather peculiar, said Futian. Goddess Chihuan stepped through the air towards Futian until she was right in front of him. I don't want the common people of the outside world to disturb us, she said. Here there is only you and me. You can confide in me anything you want. How does that sound? We have only just met. Why speak of confiding things in each other? Futian's face was impassive as he spoke. We may have just met, but I have heard your name for a long time. Why can't we confide in each other? Goddess Chihuan stood in front of Futian, staring right into his eyes. At that moment, a powerful will entered into Futian's mind. Suddenly, many images flashed through his mind, and many of them were images of this woman. Futian was suddenly incredibly wary. He let loose a burst of a powerful will that cut through everything. It sliced right through the images of Goddess Chihuan in his mind. Boom! Everyone outside only saw Futian take a few steps backward, after which he steadied himself and looked up into the air. Goddess Chihuan was still standing there calmly, looking extremely noble. She grinned down at him and said, I never thought you would be someone prone to infatuation, Emperor Yi. What power is this? Futian's heart trembled. He narrowed his eyes as he gazed at the figure in the air. This goddess Chihuan was able to invade his willpower and spy into his emotional world. He had never run into power like this before. If you do not mind, I would truly like to become friends with you, Emperor Yi, continued Goddess Chihuan. I do mind, said Futian coldly. He swept his gaze over her as she stood there in the sky and said, Since this is only the first time you have offended me, I will not pursue justice in this matter. If there is a next time, the consequences will be on your own head. Huh! Surprised looks came over everyone's faces. The situation had changed so quickly. Futian had just threatened Goddess Chihuan, a cultivator of the 9th tier. This was unspeakably arrogant. But considering his past victories, he had fought his way through the ancient royal family of Duan single-handedly, sweeping away all of their renhuangs. He had defeated 9th tier renhuangs before, and that had not even been the first time he had done so. Moreover, as long as their great path was not perfected, perhaps Futian really would not be too worried about them. But Goddess Chihuan was no ordinary person. She could not be compared to ordinary 9th tier renhuangs. Her cultivation techniques were mysterious and unique, and she could excite any of her opponent's desires. It seemed that she had done something to Futian before that had prompted this reaction from him. However, everyone knew that Goddess Chihuan must not have used her full power. She was testing him. If she had really acted against Futian, things would not have ended so simply. Goddess Chihuan was stunned when she heard Futian's words. She stared at him with her beautiful eyes and saw the white-haired young man staring back at her, cold will filling his deep eyes. Clearly, her invasion of his mind had angered him. You are not even the least bit concerned with saving face, are you, Lord Yi? She said, looking down at him. At that moment, noble will suffused her. I am curious, are you really able to be so rude to Emperor Yi? There was a bit of coldness in her tone as she stared at Yi Futian once more with her charming eyes. Boom! In that instant, divine light wrapped around Yi Futian, and a terrible demonic air flow swept out through the sky. The image of a divine peacock appeared, shining its brilliant light through all the heavens as well as towards Goddess Jihuan. At the same time, Yi Futian's eyes became both strange and terrible as his gaze seemed to pierce the goddess. Just try me, said Yi Futian. As they felt the violent airflow coming from him, everyone also felt a suffocating pressure. For a time, the vast area around them was silent. No one had thought Yi Futian would do this. At that moment Yi Futian, who had been ignited by anger, was like the descendant of a demon god. He was completely different from how he had been before. He floated in the air, silver hair dancing behind him like silver blades. It was an overwhelming sight. Perhaps this was the real Yi Futian. This proud son of heaven, who had come from the Donghua domain, had made his name in Four Corner Village and had swept through the ancient royal family of Duan, was now showing his true glory. Goddess Jihuan stared at Yi Futian. Try him? She was naturally not afraid of Yi Futian. But the way he was acting right now put a little bit of pressure on her. Suddenly she smiled, and it was like 100 flowers coming into bloom, both delicate and beautiful. It made all the cultivators who were watching become stunned. She had transformed from a noble empress into a charming beauty in an instant. Both of these attitudes were present within her, which made her even more alluring. It was like her image had been imprinted on everyone's mind. No wonder you are the most famous genius in the Shangqing domain. Your charm and mannerisms are impressive, Emperor Yi. There are many heroes in the Shangqing domain, and yet I do not know how many of them can compete with you, said Goddess Jihuan. As she smiled, the tense atmosphere seemed to disappear instantly. Everything was light and breezy. Yi Futian still did not retract his aura, but at that moment, everyone relaxed a little bit. Yi Futian could see that the goddess Jihuan had no intention of attacking him. He ignored her words and recalled his aura, becoming a completely different person in an instant. Off in the distance, more people were coming, including the prince and princess of the Shangyu deity nation, the cultivators of the Lu clan, and more. They stood in different places, some looking at the divine casket and others at Yi Futian. Yi Futian had clearly become a focal point for all the cultivators. Apart from the greatest figures, he was the only one who could observe the corpse within the divine casket without being instantly injured. The others, even those as powerful as Miyunlan and Moke, could not do this. Yi Futian ignored their gazes and continued to observe the divine body. Since this was the way things were going to be, he did not need to worry about it anymore. He would gaze at the corpse for a little longer before it was taken away. As time passed, Yi Futian continued to stare at the divine body. Moreover, he started trying to have the ancient characters enter his body. At that moment, he was standing in the sky gazing down at the divine casket. A halo of light was around him, and it seemed like ancient characters were carved into his body. What was most frightening was that the characters that were rushing into his eyes were having a wild effect on the world within him. Within his life palace was the spatial world that the world tree had forged. The sun and the moon hung high in the sky, and the stars revolved. But once those characters rushed in, they swept through wildly, destroying everything. Even the stars collapsed as thunder and lightning smashed everything to dust. The characters that had charged and tried to destroy everything. They even attacked the world tree itself. This was the first time Yi Futian had been in this situation. Previously, even when he had encountered a divine item, the world tree had still stood firm as the absolute master and had even swallowed and absorbed their power, just like it had with the heart of the demon peacock god. But this time, the corpse of Shinjia, the great emperor within the divine casket, was giving off endless characters that were all rushing through all his spirits and attacking everything. A great, stormy wave rose within his world tree life palace. Boom! Yi Futian began trembling incessantly. After a moment, he groaned, and his body was sent flying backward. He spat up a mouthful of blood. His face had gone deathly white. But as he landed on the ground, he sat up and crossed his legs. A porcelain bottle appeared in his hand. He crushed it and took out a pill from within, swallowing it. Powerful life was suffused his body. But even so, his trembling body was still giving off great booming noises. Everyone was staring at him, watching more and more blood pour out of his mouth. His face was so pale it seemed as if he was suffering from great pain. I was too impulsive, he said to himself. He had done this a little too sloppily. He thought he could adapt himself to this power, but obviously, he was nowhere near good enough. Xia Qingyuan strode towards him, a worried look on her face. The cultivators of Four Corner Village were concerned as well. This man seemed to have bitten off more than he could chew this time. Is he gravely injured? All the cultivators around were watching Yi Futian. This was the first time they had seen him get hurt while looking at the divine casket. Previously he had had no problems. The power of the characters coming out of the divine casket was truly frightening to behold. Yi Futian kept spitting out mouthfuls of blood. His aura had grown much weaker. Many people, though he had been wounded to the very core, that his great path had suffered injury. It would truly be a shame if one of the world's top figures fell just from observing the divine body. However, after a while, Yi Futian's aura began to gradually revive. Divine trees surrounded him as his body became a tree of life. He began to recover swiftly. Everyone could clearly sense that Yi Futian's weak aura was beginning to strengthen. What a marvelous recovery! Everyone thought to themselves as they watched him. His rejuvenation was so swift that they were all shocked. Previously, they had clearly felt how grievous the injury that Yi Futian had received was. He had possibly even been injured in the very root of his great path. However, he had still been able to start healing so quickly. This is the great path of life. To have such a robust life aura is something that even peak-level Renhuangs would not necessarily be able to obtain, said an upper-level Renhuang as he spoke with those around him. Many people nodded in agreement. They had also noticed how vigorous Yi Futian's life aura was. Before long, Yi Futian had healed enough where he was as good as new. He had returned to peak fitness. At that moment, Blind Tai and Fang Huan came over to his side and whispered, "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," Yi Futian answered. "Be a little more careful. Don't put yourself in danger in your rush for success," Blind Tai reminded him. "I will take care," said Yi Futian with a nod. "Do you still want to keep going?" said Xia Qingyuan from behind them. Her tone was cold. Yi Futian looked over at her and saw that her beautiful eyes held him in an icy, tight gaze. "Don't worry about it, I will be careful," said Yi Futian with a smile at Xia Qingyuan. However, she did not seem satisfied with his response. She kept glaring at him. Yi Futian rose and stretched out, looking very casual. However, when his eyes fell upon the divine casket, a sharp look appeared in them. He turned to Xia Qingyuan again and said, "Does it look like I'm having trouble? This divine casket cannot injure me to my core." "So what happened before was not an injury," said Xia Qingyuan. "Compared to the risks I take when cultivating, something like this which I am in complete control of is nothing," Yi Futian said to her telepathically. "Don't worry. I know my limits. Moreover, I have already begun to understand something from it. It will probably help me with my cultivation and might even help me observe the abilities of the ancient gods." When she heard his telepathic message, Xia Qingyuan looked at him. He seemed to be completely unconcerned. She knew that she would not be able to convince him. Once he had made up his mind, she had no way of changing it. She could only say, "Don't put yourself into too much danger." "I won't," said Yi Futian with a nod and a smile. Then he looked at the divine casket once again. His gaze became fixed upon it. Although he had received a terrible wound before, he did not shrink back from it in the least. If he could really take this power into himself and comprehend it, it would perhaps be very helpful for his cultivation. Thinking of this, Yi Futian once again stepped forward. This made everyone look at him. Was he going to try again? This man was truly not afraid that he would not be able to withstand it. While they were still considering this, Yi Futian had once again come up to the divine casket. A very strange phenomenon happened outside of the domain chief's manor. Divine light glittered within a certain space, which held a set of sacred remains. Despite so many supreme people throughout the Shangqing domain coming to that place, only Yi Futian alone was able to gain access to the sacred remains and train with them. Yi Futian went into that space on the second day, intending to train near that divine casket. He had sustained many injuries, yet he seemed like some undying immortal, capable of recovering very quickly every time he sustained injuries. The whole process had been repeated so many times over that the cultivators present were all in awe at just how tenacious he was. Yet, he was forbidden from going inside the place holding the casket by the guards from the domain chief's manor. The chief himself had given orders forbidding anyone from looking at the divine casket, but they allowed those supreme cultivators to do so anyway. However, the place at which the divine casket was held was barred from entrance. "Emperor Yi, please train outside," one of the Renhuang guards said to Yi Futian. Despite forbidding Yi Futian from getting inside, he was, nonetheless, being very polite. His powers had been seen by all cultivators present, after all, and they all deemed that someone with such powers would definitely be able to achieve great things. He could possibly even stand at the very top of the Shangqing domain if he were to be able to stay alive. Yi Futian looked at the person who got in his way, and a faint pressure actually emanated from those deep eyes of his. At that moment yet another person walked up to his side, saying to the Renhuang guard, "I want to take a look inside as well. Let us pass." The Renhuang guard took a look at the one coming up to Yi Futian's side and nodded. "Yes, my lady." The one who asked for the guard to make way was none other than Princess Lingxi. Despite the rules laid down before, her status was superior. As such, no one dared to object when she was the one giving Yi Futian passage. Furthermore, she wanted to get inside herself as well. "Thank you, Princess Lingxi." Yi Futian nodded at Zhou Lingxi. "I've seen what you're capable of, Sir Yi. I'm curious if you'll be able to actually learn something using the divine casket. I'll be watching you from afar, and I assume that I won't be getting in your way," Zhou Lingxi said. "Of course it wouldn't," Yi Futian replied. There was nothing else he could say. She was the one who let him inside, so it was ridiculous for him to tell her to stay outside instead. "I look forward to it." Zhou Lingxi flashed a smile, which stunned him for quite a bit. That brimming smile of hers felt rather surreal to him. Zhou Lingxi, who was a female Renhuang, actually had a tinge of pure beauty about her. The tone with which she talked to him made him feel like he had traveled through time, triggering some emotional fluctuations inside him. "What is it?" Zhou Lingxi saw Yi Futian staring at her and asked, feeling rather surprised. "It's nothing." Yi Futian snapped back to reality and smiled. "After you, Princess." "Sure." Zhou Lingxi nodded as both of them walked into that space. Countless eyes were looking at them. Both of them walked to the space between the stone beams and then walked up the stairs to reach the divine casket. Some people murmured under their breaths after seeing how the two of them looked like a match made in heaven. "Emperor Yi and Princess Lingxi sure look like a good fit for each other." Quite a number of them nodded. There was no need to say more about her status as the princess, and her powers were superb as well. Yi Futian was extremely dashing with his white garb and silver hair. His talents were so extraordinary that hardly anyone throughout the Shangqing domain could be compared to him. If such an extraordinary figure were to be able to pair up with the princess, it would have been quite a story to tell, just like how it had been with Mu Yunlan and Nahai Qianxue back then. A good number of people talked after hearing what was said. The two of them really did look like a good match for each other. However, there were also some displeased by what they heard. "A bunch of mortals who know next to nothing." Condor-sama looked at the expression of some people by its side and mumbled. "Rhui, I see it. There's only one princess fitting enough to be by his side." The look of some princess by his side softened somewhat. The bird took note of that, and thought that its days would probably be easier. Yi Futian and Zhou Lingxi walked up the steps and arrived not far away from the divine casket. Divine light emanated from the stone pillars around it. "There was no path in this world," Zhou Lingxi murmured in a subdued tone. Her body was subjected to terrifying pressure, causing her aura inside to fluctuate. She then commented, "I wonder what level Emperor Xinjia was at all those years ago, daring to utter such words. I assume that you've heard of rumors regarding the collapse of the heavenly path." Yi Futian then said to Zhou Lingxi. "I do." She nodded. "I heard that there were some extremely powerful people that emerged in ancient times and that the heavenly path balked under the power they commanded. Perhaps those people had been fighting the heavenly path the whole time," Yi Futian muttered. Zhou Lingxi looked at him and nodded, then adding, "It is often said that there is no end to one's cultivation. Yet, when one reaches the most powerful of levels, one will naturally need to break the shackles and start all over. Perhaps these supreme overlords in ancient times were daring enough to fight the heavenly path. This space will really be able to wreak the will of the great path on me." "Right," Yi Futian then said. "Please stay here, Princess. If you were to proceed any further, you'd probably be in danger." "All right, I shall stay here and watch while you look at the sacred remains to further your learning." Zhou Lingxi nodded and smiled. The people outside were watching the whole time while they chatted. It looked like Zhou Lingxi indeed had intentions of getting close to Yi Futian. Given her status, she had no need to go so far otherwise. A superb genius like no other would catch the attention of even the daughter of the domain chief manor indeed. Yi Futian walked up to the divine casket. That time, he was walking up to the casket from that space within. His sight was on the sacred remains within. At that moment, the feeling was far more intense than looking at the sacred remains from outside. Countless runes rushed into his eyes right away and then surged into his life palace. The world of his life palace, as well as his body, were totally different at that moment. His blood seemed to be of golden color, which emanated an incredibly dazzling divine glow. This made him look like an overlord of all the humans, and he truly was a cut above the rest. Dazzling divine light shrouded his body, making him look like a young great emperor. The world of his life palace was even more terrifying. Sacred light dazzled everywhere, enveloping the entire place. The world tree had turned into a divine tree, shooting up to the heavens. Its branches spread far and wide, connecting the world. The swaying branches and leaves emanated a divine glow, which was extremely dazzling. It seemed it might be readying itself for the attack that was to come. As expected, as the boundless runes surged into his life palace, they invaded the whole place like towering waves, crushing everything in their path. Boom! Frightening rumbles seemed to be heard from within his body, so much so that even Zhou Lingxi, who was standing not far away, trembled deep down, finding the commotion a little frightening. She wondered just what Yi Futian was doing that allowed him to resist the invasion from the sacred remains. Furthermore, she was curious as to what Yi Futian was trying to achieve. He looked as if he was completely drowned within a short period of time. Zhou Lingxi's mind was thoroughly shaken as she stood by the side. She felt as if she was experiencing the rumbles herself as well. She wondered what he was trying to learn through those sacred remains. Yi Futian was sent reeling back before long again, sustaining injuries just like before. However, he was hardly fazed, and that look in his eyes looked just as steeled as ever. He simply went to the side and sat down with his legs crossed, meditating to recover and looking at ease. It was as if he had gotten very used to all that had just happened. Zhou Lingxi thought, as she was looking at his incredibly handsome looks, that other than talent, he had been able to come so far due to factors that had to do with his temperament. There was an air of seriousness about him when he trained, which she had never seen. He remained completely unfazed despite all the injuries he sustained. Those outside were still only able to watch, unable to do anything. Yi Futian remained training inside several days since then, and Zhou Lingxi was present the whole time. Whenever Titans came to visit, they came up close and looked inside. Their sight would often linger on Yi Futian. Despite the presence of said Titans, Yi Futian looked completely at ease. He was devoted to his own training and ignored anything else completely, entering a trance. Yi Futian was still training that day. He stood before the divine casket, clad with divine light, looking like a heavenly god. Dazzling divine light emanated all over him, and the rumbling in his body sounded like towering waves. At present, what he saw in his own world seemed to no longer be just runes but a true god. The sacred remains within the casket of great Emperor Xinjia seemed to have been resurrected, standing before him. All those boundless runes seemed to have become a part of him. His body became like a world of its own, and those runes looked like all the rules governing that world. Futian seemed to want to take a closer look. He seemed to be able to see great Emperor Xinjia appearing right before him, and the Emperor looked like a true god just by standing around. Boom! Futian was sent flying yet again, and it was more serious that time. He was blasted off of the steps right away, crashing into a stone pillar far away. He coughed up blood and sustained massive injuries. Those outside gasped at the scene. Sir Yi! Zhou Lingxi turned around and made her way down the steps. Futian then supported himself with his hand on the pillar as he sat up, leaning on the pillar. He shook his head, then smiled and said, "I'm fine." He then closed his eyes to train after that. Zhou Lingxi felt rather moved upon seeing all that. Despite being such a supreme being, he was still putting his life on the line just to further his training, ignoring the cost to himself. The cultivators outside were thoroughly impressed. Every single supreme genius, while indeed possessing superb talent, was just as hard-working. At that moment, divine light dazzled from within the domain chief's manor. A group of people came, and titans from all corners appeared one by one. The chief came out to greet them personally as he scanned the crowd. "News from the Imperial Palace, then?" someone asked. "Indeed." The chief nodded and continued. "It is the will of the great emperor that the divine casket of great Emperor Xinjia shall be taken care of by the Shangqing domain, given that it was found in Shangqing domain itself. The Imperial Palace will not interfere." Chapter 2171 Constructing the Divine Mausoleum. The man speaking was watched by all who were present, and all of them felt something right there and then. The palace's decision to not take away the divine casket and leave it for those at the Shangqing domain, where the divine casket was discovered, to deal with it spoke volume of its magnanimity. They thought that only the likes of the Imperial Palace would be able to be so magnanimous. They had actually refrained from claiming the body of an ancient god. The Imperial Palace would only need to say the word for the divine casket to be delivered to them otherwise. Yet those from the Imperial Palace actually told them to take care of the casket as they saw fit. But then again, none from the domain itself would have dared to fight the domain chief's manor for the right to the casket. As such, the divine casket would probably be left at the domain chief's manor for good, serving as a sacred relic of the place. But then again, while that was the common thought among those present, with the titans from the cultivation forces arriving, it was probably not all that easy for the domain chief's manor to claim the casket as its own. At that moment, the place appeared unusually silent. The supreme titans were all present. None of them spoke, and they just looked at the chief who just emerged from his residence. The atmosphere of the place seemed to appear rather weird. It would seem that all of them were waiting for someone else to speak first. "The great emperor is generous enough to leave the divine casket for us, the cultivators of Shangqing domain," someone said. Someone had finally spoken after the silence persisted for some time. The man who was speaking was none other than the leader of the Nahai clan. He looked at the chief and continued. "We of the Nahai clan were the ones who discovered the divine casket. It was then brought here by the chief to report to the Imperial Palace. Now that word from the Imperial Palace has arrived, how would you intend to deal with this divine casket then?" The divine casket was so out of their world that none of them, despite their powers, were able to learn from it. Yet they nonetheless knew of the value of the sacred remains which the casket held. That was the body of great Emperor Xinjia, and it had devolved into boundless runes to the point that the body couldn't be observed. Even they, the pinnacle cultivators that reigned supreme over Shangqing domain, would suffer backlash just by taking one look at the body. They also knew repeated looks would even cause serious injuries. They were thinking if they were able to take it home for further study. Of course, they were definitely not the only ones harboring such thoughts. None of those from the top-notch cultivation forces wouldn't have wanted the divine casket for themselves so as to peer into the secrets harbored by the sacred remains. If they were to be able to get more powerful in the future, they might actually be able to learn what the Imperial realm was like. Whoever was holding the casket at the moment, the others wouldn't just back away from claiming it, even if said holder was the domain chief's manor. Domain Chief Zhou looked at the crowd, and despite hearing the question clearly, he didn't rush to give an answer. Although he was the one with the most authority in all of the Shangqing domain, he was still unable to so casually order people from top-notch cultivation forces around because those people were not actually his subordinates. They were cultivators of the divine prefecture like everyone else. And while they would do him favors and give him face, they were not about to comply with his every command. It was especially so when one such divine relic was concerned. He naturally knew that if the domain chief's manor were to claim such a relic as their own just like that, he would have invoked the wrath of everyone present. The forces would be displeased with either the domain chief's manor or with him, so much so that some might actually get into an altercation. As such, he needed to be cautious with the matter. The divine casket of great Emperor Xinjia was discovered in the Tsengyuan continent by chance. As such, it could be considered as something that belongs to nobody. While many discovered it before, nobody was able to take it away. That is, until all of you came. Then you all brought the casket here to report to the Imperial Palace. However, given that the Imperial Palace's reply was for us of the Shangqing domain to take care of it on our own, it was apparent that the great Emperor was wise and wished to see the divine prefecture be strong. Giving us the divine casket to the Shangqing domain was an act to see that we could learn by using it. The chief elaborated. In that case, we shall not let the great Emperor down. Everyone was still listening silently, and some were already frowning. The leader of the Nehai clan was able to more or tell what the chief meant, and he knew that the chief would probably still intend to keep the divine casket around. As expected, the chief then continued, I shall build a divine mausoleum near the domain chief's manor, in which the divine casket of great Emperor Xinjia shall be placed. Guards would be assigned to the mausoleum, and all top-notch figures from the continent shall be permitted to enter the place. Any from the Shangqing domain who are sufficiently powerful will be permitted entry as well, so as to ensure that the cultivators of the Shangqing domain are able to learn by observing the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia for generations to come. What do you all think of this? Everyone knew what the chief meant by what he said. Constructing the divine mausoleum by the side of the domain chief's manor, and placing the divine casket inside was but a ploy for the domain chief's manor to keep the casket under their control. They could research and learn from the divine casket at all times, yet it was ridiculous for those of the top-notch forces to stay back at the Shangqing domain all the time. The divine casket was anything but ordinary, which meant that studying from it was anything but easy. As soon as the divine mausoleum was finished, the divine casket would be put completely under the domain chief's manor's control. However, the way the chief put it was so perfect that they couldn't come up with any reason to object, as it would be more ridiculous to think that the divine casket could be placed on their respective continents instead. Furthermore, the ground they stood on at that very moment was right outside the domain chief's manor. The leader of the Nehai clan said that they were the ones who discovered the divine casket, but what the chief said had practically denied such claims. The divine casket was dug out by chance, to begin with, and the ones who discovered it earliest were not even qualified to get inside. If anyone were to be said to be the earliest to observe the divine casket, it would be Mu Yunlan and Yi Futian. Yet, it was not to say that the casket would belong to any who laid eyes on it first. The divine casket belonged to none, and any would be able to fight to claim it. However, given that no one fought over it, and it had been brought to the domain chief's manor instead, it was only natural that the chief got to call the shots. Silence blanketed the place yet again. No one said anything, and they all seemed to be thinking. Despite feeling displeased deep down, no one stood out to object to it. Anyone who dared to object first would have gotten on the bad side of the chief, after all. Furthermore, such objection would be futile all the same. Moreover, the chief didn't say that the divine mausoleum would be constructed within the domain chief's manor's grounds, and the place would be built elsewhere instead. That meant that he had indeed taken into consideration the thoughts of others. He would have simply built the place inside the domain chief's manor, and then claimed the casket as their own otherwise. But then again, as far as practical application was concerned, the divine casket was still practically theirs. If the divine mausoleum is to be built, is it to say that my juniors would be allowed to train inside at any time we wish? The leader of the Nahai clan asked. That is a given, the chief replied. All from the top-notch cultivation forces of the upper 9 heavens, including those from Four Corner Village, would be permitted to freely enter the divine mausoleum at all times. Everyone nodded, seemingly having accepted the proposal. In terms of raw power in the Shangqing domain, those of the domain chief's manor would probably still be the most powerful. Even those supreme beings would hardly be able to match Shou Mohuang, the young master, let alone the chief himself. Furthermore, the cultivation forces also deemed it imperative to not offend the domain chief's manor unless absolutely necessary. Even if there were to be anyone who didn't agree to it, it eventually still wouldn't have changed anything. There was literally nowhere else the divine casket could be placed after all. Well then, given that the chief has given his word, we will naturally not object to the proposal, the leader of the Nahai clan said, giving face to the chief. He agreed to the proposal right away. I'm fine with it as well. The leader of the Lu clan seconded the decision. With 2 of the greatest clan leaders having agreed to it, it would be pointless for the others not to be alright with it. Everyone else then agreed to the proposal of having the divine mausoleum built near the domain chief's manor, placing the divine casket within. Well then, that settles the matter. I shall order for the construction of the divine mausoleum and place the divine casket within. When the construction of the divine mausoleum is completed, we shall gather around and discuss some other matters. The actual purpose of bringing you all together was actually to discuss something else. But the case with the divine casket has taken precedence instead, the chief said, and everyone nodded. The purpose of them being there was not initially due to the divine casket. The appearance of the divine casket was but an accident. At that moment Yi Futian, who was recovering by the side, opened his eyes and looked at the chief. With the divine casket not being taken away by the imperial palace, he would be able to rest easy, as that meant that he could have more time to learn from the sacred remains. Those of Four Corner Village were allowed to enter the divine mausoleum any time after all. There would be no need for you to rush then, Sir Yi. You will have plenty of time to learn from here on out. Zhou Lingxi smiled at Yi Futian as she spoke to him. She saw that Yi Futian had seemed to be racing against time, sustaining injury after injury. Yet he still insisted on learning. However, there was no longer a need to do so. Yi Futian nodded and said, The great emperor is indeed magnanimous. Indeed. Zhou Lingxi nodded and added, Well then, in that case, let's head outside. How about I give you a tour inside the domain chief's manor, Sir Yi? Yi Futian looked at her and said, Thank you, Princess Lingxi. I'm indeed getting exhausted from training from the past several days, and a break would be nice. However, I'll be taking a rest in an inn so that I don't get in your way. Sure. Zhou Lingxi didn't say anything else. She nodded and added, When you have the time, we shall walk around in the manor again. That would be nice. Yi Futian nodded, and both of them walked outside. Zhou Lingxi bade him farewell as soon as they both emerged outside, returning to the domain chief's manor, which caused the chief to look at Yi Futian. Yi Futian went back to where his own place, and saw cold eyes looking at him. He felt rather exasperated as he rubbed his brow and said, Let's head back. Chapter 2172, Yet Another Gathering. Yi Futian trained alone in the inn. He had been training in isolation right after he returned from the domain chief's manor. He was seen sitting cross-legged at the moment. Great path rumbling was heard from his body like a tsunami. The terrifying power of the Great Path howled within the world of his life palace, causing divine light of the Great Path to keep seeping out of his body. The power of the Great Path tempered his body over and over, growing his physical body stronger and stronger, as the will of the Great Path became increasingly intense. It took quite a while before he stopped training. The divine light of the Great Path surged all over his body, causing his body to seem to have developed into a body of the Great Path. His eyes were filled with the intense will of the Great Path when he opened them again. Voom! the light swept all over his body, and a formless fluctuation appeared, spreading everywhere around him. It caused the others from the inn to look where he was training. It was apparent that they had all sensed the will of the great path, which emanated from his body. He got up and opened the door, seeing several people standing right outside. Someone walked to his room, and it was none other than Duan Qiong. He glanced at Yi Futian and sensed that Yi Futian's bearing seemed to have changed somewhat. He then grinned and said, "I knew that you were probably about to finish training when I sensed your aura. Your level has gotten somewhat deeper, and I'd say that you wouldn't take long to make it to level 6 of Renhuang Realm. I've made some progress." Yi Futian nodded. Furthermore, the progress he made was not that of some kind of path or that of the divine wheel of the great path. The progress he made was overarching, and he made a comprehensive leap forward. His understanding of the great path became more profound, and his level got even deeper. With the powers of great path which he had developed so far becoming more powerful, so was his divine wheel of the great path. I'd say that even I, at level 6 perfection of the great path, wouldn't able to win against you as you are right now. If you were to be able to make it to level 6 of Renhuang Realm, even those at level 7 perfection of the realm wouldn't be able to beat you. By then, I'm afraid that only the likes of Miyun Lan could contend. Duan Qiong felt rather impressed. He was naturally able to tell that Yi Futian was still very young, yet his combat prowess was already above that of countless supreme ones of the previous generation. If he were to make even further progress, he would possibly be able to touch the peak of combat prowess, excluding those who were deemed the Titans. Judging from his rate of progress at cultivation, he probably wouldn't need many years, so much so that he might only need a dozen to 20 years to achieve such a goal. Yi Futian might actually stand a chance at reaching the levels of the Titans before he turned 100 years old, and that would have been rather harrowing. I've managed to learn something watching the sacred remains of the great Emperor Xinjia in that casket," he added. That was the whole truth. He would come back with considerable gains every time he observed the sacred remains. Despite being repeatedly injured, every single injury was, nonetheless, a temperance of sorts to him, enabling him to grow stronger every time. He was even able to vaguely sense the deepest secrets of great Emperor Xinjia, and just how terrifying said great emperor was. Even just a single look would have brought about a surreal amount of learning. Yet those Titans were unable to observe the sacred remains. Right. Duan Qiong nodded. I'm somewhat jealous of you. At present, I've only taken one look, and I've never been more miserable before. It would seem that I'd have no hope of learning through the sacred remains. When the divine mausoleum is completed, you could train at the Shangqing continent for a period of time, learning as you stay in the divine mausoleum often. That's what I'm thinking. Yi Futian grinned as he replied. When the divine mausoleum was completed and the divine casket placed within, he would stay around and train for a period of time there. All that he had learned so far, other than furthering his training in the Great Path, he had also vaguely sensed something mystical, so mystical that he was still unable to place it. He deemed that he might need more time to learn from it. He looked outside and saw a good number of people gathering around. Qin took a look at him and said, "You're about to make a breakthrough? I'm getting such a feeling. It probably won't take long. I should be able to make a breakthrough within a year," he replied. Cultivators were very perceptive of their own progress, and he already had such a feeling about himself. 1 year was actually a conservative estimation. In actual fact, he vaguely sensed that he was mere steps away from making a breakthrough, and he had probably lacked some kind of catalyst. "You plan on training like how you did before?" A grumbling voice was heard. Yi Futian saw Xia Qingyuan looking at him, and she was feeling rather displeased. The way she looked at it, the way he trained was practically self-torture, inflicting severe damage on himself as he trained. Given his talents and powers, he would still be able to make a breakthrough without training like that. "Qingyuan, you don't understand what I feel every time I look at the sacred remains. If you knew, you wouldn't have thought much of it," Yi Futian said to her. "Every time I look at the sacred remains in the casket, every attack was actually a process of tempering on my path. What I've accumulated would bring about further change in me, which was why I felt that it wouldn't take me long to make my next breakthrough. Such opportunities were hard to come by, and they are now right before my eyes. How could I pass up the offer? I know that you're worried, but you know what kind of powers I'm good at. The injuries were hardly more than mere pain to me, and none of it would affect my foundations. Such injuries are utterly beneath mentioning when compared to the growth of my powers, don't you think? Yi Futian explained. Xia Qingyuan naturally was able to understand what he said. In actual fact, he was able to comprehend it all, yet when she saw him undergo such a torturous process of temperance over and over, she felt awful for him nonetheless. While she was going through all that on her own, she was still able to sense just how intense the pain was as he was being tempered by the sacred remains. He wouldn't have ended up with severe injuries every time otherwise. Relax. Yi Futian clapped on her shoulder and added, compared to what we've been through before, this is nothing. She naturally knew how much he had been through throughout his journey. She lowered her head and nodded. But still, don't push yourself too far. Don't get the kind of injuries that you won't recover from. That was the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia, and any lapse of judgment could have come with severe repercussions. There had been times when he had been so anxious to make progress that he had been even more severely injured than before. Thanks to his ridiculous healing powers, he was able to make it without any serious repercussions. Seems like it's getting increasingly rowdy outside. He cast his glance outside and was able to see many people in the air heading towards the area where the domain chief's manor was. The domain chief's manor intended to construct the divine mausoleum to house the divine casket, which naturally caught the city's attention. That divine mausoleum would most probably become yet another important landmark of the Shangqing domain. But then again, that was only if the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia were still inside. He continued training in the inn for the next several days, and the commotion outside remained. Many top-notch figures in the domain chief's manor would definitely need to build the place to be extraordinarily sturdy. There were even pinnacle Rahuang figures laying down arrays in the divine mausoleum so as to build a foundation of the great path with it. If the divine mausoleum was any less sturdy, any commotion that it could encounter in the future could probably bring the entire place down right away. However, none of that had anything to do with him. He simply shut himself in to train and cared about nothing else. That remained until one day when the divine mausoleum's construction was completed. Those from the domain chief's manor went out to inform the titans of the supreme forces to have them head to the domain chief's manor. A supremely majestic building was erected somewhere nearby the domain chief's manor. The place was huge and looked very tall and mighty. Furthermore, it had truly been constructed in the form of a mausoleum fitting for a god. Other than that, they had indeed placed the divine casket containing the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia inside, thus truly making it a divine mausoleum. The order which the chief gave was considered an act of respect towards that great emperor. They had been very insolent before for interrupting the rest of the sacred remains of the great emperor, yet there was no way around it. There was just no way the physical body of an ancient god, when unearthed, would be able to rest in peace, as countless would certainly fight to get their hands on it. The very reason why such a thing never happened with that sacred remains was that Yi Futian had brought the divine casket there. Furthermore, given how difficult it was to even take a look at the remains, claiming and taking it away was anything but easy. As such, there was probably no cultivation force capable of just hauling the divine casket away from where it was. The center of the mausoleum was very tall, and it was built in the form of a spire. The divine casket was moved inside, with this spot serving as its resting place. Countless formidable ones arrived outside the divine mausoleum en masse. The news spread for several days, and many cultivators from the city showed up. Other than the completion of the divine mausoleum, that was also the day which the domain chief's manor summoned the forces from all corners. There was just no way they wouldn't have showed up. A group of people took to the air. Those people were none other than Yi Futian and those with him. Chapter 2173 News of the Void Realm. Yi Futian and those with him landed. Before the divine mausoleum, there was an empty field where the fighters from the domain chief's manor were standing guard. There were quite a lot of cultivators from top-notch cultivation forces that had arrived before him. Let's get over there. Duan Tianxiong and Old Ma were there as well. They led their entourage over to that spot. That day was the day when the Divine Mausoleum was opened, as well as the day the chief would hold a meeting to discuss matters. There were people from top-notch cultivation forces coming to that area one after another. Some were chatting among themselves while others walked up to them. The leader of the Nahai clan took a look at Duan Tianxiong and Old Ma before his gaze rested on Futian. Will he not be present for the meeting today? The leader of the Nahai clan asked Old Ma. The clan leader had been one of the three who showed up at Four Corner Village when the village experienced quite a commotion. That man the clan leader was referring to was someone of unimaginable power from the village. He was every bit on par with the three of them. As such, they retreated from the village and told their men to back off, acknowledging the existence of Four Corner Village. With that master in charge, it was near impossible for the three to take over the village. Even if they were to do so, the cost would probably be beyond what they could sustain. As such, they would naturally not take such risks. Furthermore, they sensed that that master had some special relationship with the village. If they were to act against that master back in the village, it would probably be them at a disadvantage instead. At that moment, it became apparent that the master was unwilling to show despite the fact that the chief was holding a meeting. This made the master as mysterious as anybody could imagine one to be. The master is a hermit, and he involves himself with nothing but the affairs of the village. I'm certain that the chief will understand, Old Ma replied, and the leader of the Nahai clan chuckled. Many members from other cultivation forces showed up one after another. A huge group of people headed over at this moment, and the man taking the lead was none other than Zhou Muhuang. He was followed by his people. Zhou Lingxi was among them. She then took a look at Futian and nodded at him with a smile. Futian naturally returned the gesture. Xia Qingyuan's eyes darted between the two of them quite a bit. *T, the condor thought to itself. It simply turned its head away, pretending to have seen nothing. Zhou Lingxi was not the only one. Goddess Jihuan, Bai Yan, Mo Ke, Muyunlan, and a few others carefully glanced at Futian as well. It became apparent that while he had not been in the Shangqing domain for long, word of his deeds had spread far and wide, making him one of the topmost figures in the domain. There were few among his peers capable of being compared to him. As such, even during such events when top-notch cultivation forces gathered around, he could still attract a lot of attention. Welcome, everyone! A man was seen landing on the ground. He was none other than Chief Zhou. He looked at the crowd and said, Let's get inside the Divine Mausoleum for further discussion. Very well. Everyone nodded. The chief took the lead, and the titans from all other top-notch cultivation forces followed right behind him. Duan Tianxiong and Old Ma walked up as well. Other cultivators from said forces followed right behind the titans as they went inside the Divine Mausoleum. Zhou Lingxi slowed down and got to walk with Futian's group. She came before Futian before long. How has your training been the past several days? Zhou Lingxi looked at Futian. She commented, It would seem that your bearing has changed somewhat. While it's not all that obvious, it's nonetheless somewhat noticeable still. Changes have happened, indeed. I've come to learn quite a bit from looking at the divine casket back then, and my understanding of the Great Path has deepened somewhat, Futian replied. That explains it. Zhou Lingxi grinned and continued. With the Divine Mausoleum finished, you could train here from here on out. I'm afraid it won't take you long to break into the next level. I hope so. Futian nodded as the group walked into the mausoleum. The Divine Mausoleum was built in such a way that it appeared magnificent. There was a passage within and a stone door not far away. The door remained opened and was guarded by Renhuang guards, who stood to the sides. This door has a massive array carved into it, and it is melded with the place into a single entity. So long as there are 2 guards assigned here, no one could force their way in and sneak into the mausoleum. That is unless they are someone of our level, Chief Zhou introduced. Other than that, the entire Divine Mausoleum is one single entity, and it has a massive array in place. Even if the intruders were able to get inside, the place would be sealed up immediately after the array is activated. No one other than very powerful beings will be able to escape. The chief has really put his mind to it. Everyone nodded, but that line wasn't actually all that sincere. The location of the mausoleum meant that the place was basically under the domain chief's manor's control. Everyone else had to go there if they were to study and research the sacred remains. Passing through that passage led them to an extremely majestic palace within the mausoleum. The chief had moved the entire space of that divine casket in there. Stone pillars were erected in the air, and there was that staircase as well, which, without a doubt, led to the divine casket above. As such, the central area of the divine mausoleum was in the shape of a spire. On the walls around the spire, training platforms were hovering in midair, and they were all of different positions. Sitting at the very front of the platforms would allow one to see the sacred remains inside the casket. And if they were to be sent reeling behind, they would be stopped by the walls. There were countless lines on the walls which glittered with divine light. The entire divine mausoleum was like a super-powerful great array in itself. The place was not actually complex, so much so that one could even say that it was actually very simple. The place was still mainly used for training, and as such, it only needed to be sufficiently safe and sturdy. There was no need to complicate the layout at all. With the divine casket there, all of you can come and train as you wish. The chief then added, "There is one other thing that I summoned you all here for, and that is to discuss the matters of warfare of the divine prefecture. Given that all of you have been training for many years, I'm sure you are all familiar with what happened hundreds of years ago. Ever since the passage leading to the Void Realm was opened, a great many forces went there for a pilgrimage. That included those from outside the divine prefecture who had taken an interest in the Void Realm and clashed with the forces from the divine prefecture. The war happening in the Void Realm has gotten increasingly intense in recent years, and I wonder if any of you have heard of it." Futian was rattled deep down. Ever since he came to the divine prefecture, all connections with the Void Realm had been severed, including those with some monsters which he used to control. Said connections were completely severed as soon as he entered the divine prefecture. He deemed that this had to do with both realms being of different spaces. The chief then claimed that there was a war going on in the Void Realm at present. He wondered if said war would involve the entire Void Realm. He wondered if all whom he knew from the Void Realm were doing fine. He came to worry intensely for them. Many years passed, and he had been very diligent at training, thinking that he could return when he had finally reached the pinnacle of Renhuang Realm. However, his heart sank as soon as he heard the news, and he wanted more than anything to return there at once. "We've heard some stories about it, but we don't know much," the leader of the Lu clan said. "Some other forces were interested in the Void Realm, but they were not one of those people. The Dark Court has invaded the Void Realm, nullifying the treaty all those years ago. They are waging war. There were also other forces seen appearing at the same time. According to news from the Imperial Palace, there are now signs of the war spreading. Also, the Dark Court has begun to amass more troops, commanding the armies of the Dark World to make their way there. The Divine Prefecture is under a lot of stress as well, requiring support from the 18 domains. All of you are top-notch forces of the Shangqing domain. If the Imperial Palace were to call us to arms, I'd hope that all of you could cooperate and send your most formidable warriors there. What do you all think of this?" The chief then continued slowly. "Besides, this would be a great opportunity to test one's mettle. Not only would the forces from the 18 domains would be there, but there will also be forces outside the Divine Prefecture getting involved. It is a grand event that is hardly ever seen during times of peace. The Dark Court has made the Void Realm into a battlefield?" the leader of the Nahai clan asked. "There are possible signs of it." The chief nodded. "Sir, how is the war going in the Void Realm now?" Futian couldn't help but ask, feeling rather worried. "I've not been in the Void Realm, so I didn't know specifically how things are in there. If you all are fine with it, I may send my men to gather your forces. Of course, anyone who is unwilling to join will not be pressed to do so," the chief continued. Everyone nodded and made it apparent that the chief had their support. Of course, it was entirely up to them to decide just how powerful would the fighters they send. Naturally, nobody would refuse such a request under these circumstances. Thank you, all of you, the chief then said. With the divine mausoleum completed, I'm sure all of you would like to stay around for a bit. I have yet to act as a proper host despite being the host. As such, I have thrown a banquet in the manor. How about we move there now? Everyone nodded and took a look at the casket before heading outside. There were untold numbers of fighters gathered just outside, yet the vast majority of them would probably not be able to get inside the divine mausoleum. Countless pairs of eyes looked at those who emerged from the divine mausoleum, and the chief addressed them all. The divine mausoleum is now complete, and anyone who fulfills the requirements will be permitted to train inside. However, my advice remains the same: do not attempt without caution. Everyone understood what he meant. There was literally nobody who didn't already know just how dangerous the sacred remains of the great Emperor Xinjiao were. After taking care of things over there, the chief and many formidable ones took to the air and made their way toward the domain chief's manor. Some formidable ones up front were chatting, while Futian's brow was locked tight. Xia Qingyuan could relate to his feeling at the moment, as she, too, was worried about things over there. All of their friends and families were over there, and there was no telling what would happen if the entire place became a war zone. It'll be fine. Xia Qingyuan comforted him despite worrying about the same things herself. Yeah. Futian nodded. His only wish at the moment was to get back there and check on things as soon as possible. The banquet at the Shangqing Domain Chief's manor was ready, and the people from the cultivation forces took their seats. Futian and the others around him were present, sitting with those from the village. The table beside them sat cultivators of the ancient royal family of Duan. The chief sat at the main seat, and Zhou Muhuang sat beside him. The seats below him were taken by Zhou Lingxi and some others. All of them had superior bearings. Chatter was everywhere as soon as everyone took their seats in the banquet. The chief then raised his cup, and everyone quieted down. Everyone everywhere turned their eyes to the chief. It is not every day that we all get together like this. I'd like to take this chance to see the renowned ones from the cultivation forces of the Shangqing domain better. The successors of old people, like Muhuang, have reached a decent level of training. There are also many renowned ones behind, and some had even made it to the high-level Renhuang realms and were perfect at their levels, all of whom would possibly get to the very pinnacle. Right now, those of Four Corner Village have become a part of the world, and quite a number from the village are superb. They look even more powerful than any from the cultivation forces of the Shangqing domain, including those of the domain chief's manor. It would seem that since the war all those years ago, the divine prefecture would see a new era where renowned ones emerge everywhere. The chief made his speech, and it was apparent that he had high opinions of those from Four Corner Village. In actual fact, the powers commanded by the village were indeed extremely powerful. Other than Old Ma, Fang Gai, Blind Tai, and the other elders were all cultivators whose great path levels were perfect. Their combat prowess was also extremely terrifying. Fang Huan was considered one of the later generations. While it could be said that the village had saw fractures among the generations, as all others other than those people mentioned were all incapable of cultivation, the generation after that was all capable of cultivation. As such, the place held terrifying potential. If one were to consider only those who were perfect at higher Renhuang levels, even if the individuals from all top-notch cultivation forces throughout the Shangqing domain were to be taken into account, the number would still only more or less equal those of the village. People of such levels were few and far between throughout the Shangqing domain, and Four Corner Village couldn't be judged using usual conventions. Of course, two were exiled from the village and were not actually cultivators from the village, and those two were the ones from the Nehai clan, Miyunlan and Miyunlong. From a certain standpoint, the Nehai clan was the top-notch cultivation force that had the greatest number of cultivators at such levels, other than Four Corner Village. Those at the zenith will eventually fall, and those at rock bottom will eventually rise. The Lord of Shangyu Deity Nation said, "During the war all those years ago, countless cultivators perished, and countless more died in the chaotic world. Now, with the world united as one and the wars subsided, all forces had finally and gradually regained vitality. The later generations continued to train and develop into what we are today. We will walk towards glory, riding the rising waves we are on right now. Everyone nodded. Those of the previous generation had all lived through those times. There had been untold numbers of powerful ones who had perished back then. They were actually considered fortunate to be able to survive and reign over a certain region during peace times. Indeed. The chief nodded. However, a chaotic world gives rise to heroes. Never forget that Dong Wang the Great rose to prominence at that age. Among the many renowned figures standing the pinnacle of the 18 domains today, many cultivators managed to shine in that era. They had all retreated to behind the scenes to teach their juniors in order to become great figures themselves in the eras to come. Chaotic times saw the rise of the best as well. The cultivation environment of present times is far better than what it used to be, some said, feeling rather impressed. Times changed, and time had indeed changed everything considerably. The eras back then were totally different from the present. When the cultivation environment gets considerably improved, the pressure is lacking. As such, the war against the Dark Court this time would serve as an opportunity. The chief then added, Mu Huang will be heading to the Void Realm this time. I'd like to know your thoughts. What would you do if the Imperial Palace were to call you to arms? But relax, we just chat in today's banquet, and I wouldn't mind any opinions put forth. The conflict of the Divine Prefecture is not something that a single force could steer. I would send all core members of the Nahai clan. It is indeed an opportunity like none other, the leader of the Nahai clan said. The others nodded, and at that moment, the chief looked at Yi Futian and said, I heard some rumors saying that Emperor Yi hailed from the Donghua domain and achieved great fame in the Donghua banquet. I heard that you went to the Donghua domain from the Void Realm? Everyone turned their eyes to Yi Futian as soon as the chief said what he said. Everyone wondered if Yi Futian really was from the Void Realm. Few actually knew about that, as they had only heard that Yi Futian was originally from Donghua domain, and he was hunted by the domain chief's manor of said domain. There was a wanted notice issued against him, and there were even people of top-notch forces in that domain attacking Four Corner City just to do so, but they failed nonetheless. Yi Futian was stunned, as he never anticipated that the chief would ask him such a question. He took note of the eyes on him and replied, I was indeed, but that was something that happened many years ago. When you left the Void Realm, had forces like the Dark Court made it there? The chief then asked. Yeah. Before I left, the Dark Court did open a passage leading to the Void Realm, Yi Futian replied. In actual fact, he was involved in the incident the whole way, and he played a great part in what actually happened, but he didn't elaborate on any of that. I assumed that the Dark Court was only probing their way into the place when they first arrived. How were things back then? The chief continued. 2 of the 7 kings of the Dark Court were there, and a good number of formidable people arrived. The devil generals were there as well, but there had been 2 divine generals from the Imperial Palace being there as well, he replied. The chief nodded slightly. They were probably probing only then. The entourage seemed formidable, but they had yet to send the best of their forces. Things might have changed considerably over the years. Yi Futian didn't say much, as he didn't want to talk too much about himself back in the Void Realm. It had been difficult for you to come all the way here from the Void Realm. I've heard quite a few things about you. You arrived first at the Donghua domain, then to Four Corner Village, and then to where you are now, rising to prominence along the way. Lingxi told me a lot about you, and the way I see it, your achievements in the future won't be any less than Mo Huang's. The chief continued. Many wore peculiar expressions, and the way they looked at Yi Futian changed. Many among them knew how extraordinary he was, and his future was definitely be anything but ordinary. They were not surprised that the chief was holding him in such high regard as well, but the key to their surprise was the meaning behind what the chief said. The chief mentioned both Zhou Mohuang and Zhou Lingxi when he talked to Yi Futian, and the meaning behind that was something worth looking into. You flatter me, chief. The young master is already at the pinnacle of Huang, and that is my goal, Yi Futian replied. He looked rather humble, Yet one would wonder if that was really his only goal. That was a level that he would definitely reach. Among the many renowned ones throughout Shangqing domain, only you get to look at the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia in the divine casket. I heard from Lingxi that you were able to learn through it. I'd say such an appraisal would be apartment. In fact, said appraisal might have been watered down instead. The chief laughed heartily and continued. Lingxi never complimented anyone like that, and you're the first one that caught her attention. She has mentioned things about you quite a few times. That rocked the minds of the formidable ones around, and the banquet became unusually quiet, as everyone had their ears perked. What is the chief trying to do here? Those behind Futian looked rather complicated as well, especially Xia Qingyuan. She turned her eyes at the chief, wondering what the man meant by what he said. Futian felt rather weird about it all as well, being rather puzzled as to why the chief brought such things up on an occasion like that. Zhou Lingxi was of esteemed status, and her social standing was high. She had extremely formidable powers as well, and such a person would catch massive amounts of attention. However, many wouldn't have any other thoughts, as they knew just how impossible those thoughts could be. Thank you for your compliments, Princess. It might just be me being lucky that I'm able to look at the sacred remains of great Emperor Xinjia. Futian replied. There is no need to be so humble. I could naturally see just how good you are myself. Lingxi hardly sees anyone that she is impressed with, and she speaks highly of your level. I agree with what she said. You two may get in touch more in the future when you have the chance. It would benefit both of you if you two could train together. The chief smiled and added. His intentions behind his words became increasingly obvious. Zhou Lingxi didn't look sheepish or shy as well. As a very esteemed female Renhuan of Shangqing domain, she appeared at ease, as she smiled as she looked at Futian. Is the chief trying to make Futian his son-in-law? That was the thought that came to the minds of everyone present. Mu Yunlan and Nehai Qinxue had been a couple that everyone deemed to be a match made in heaven, and the Nehai clan gained themselves a powerful son-in-law. They wondered if the domain chief's manor was trying to pull the same trick as the Nehai clan. Furthermore, it was apparent that not only was Futian's potential not below that of Mu Yunlan, but he could actually be above Mu Yunlan. Many cultivators from the Nehai clan wore complicated expressions. Zhou Muhuang had invited Futian into the domain chief's manor before, and the latter refused. Yet, if Futian were to be the son-in-law of the chief, he would then naturally be considered as a member of the domain chief's manor nonetheless. Futian also wasn't sure about what the domain chief and Zhou Lingxi meant. Humans were impulsive by nature. The higher the cultivation level a person achieved, the more self-possessed and dispassionate he became. Most cultivators could leave emotions out, and weigh the pros and cons rationally when they reached the Renhuan plane. Of course, Futian wouldn't assume that Zhou Lingxi had fallen in love with him during such a short time. That being said, the domain chief obviously made those remarks with Zhou Lingxi's permission. Otherwise, he wouldn't say it in front of everyone. In that case, what on earth did they mean? Could they genuinely intend to let him marry Zhou Lingxi on the strength of his remarkable potential and promising future? Did they want him to join the domain chief's manor? Nevertheless, the possibility felt too simple and didn't fit the domain chief's manor's usual style. Unless the domain chief's manor somehow figured out Futian's true capacity and was eager to rope him in by any possible means. However, the domain chief's manor only dropped a hint and didn't say anything explicitly. To avoid embarrassment for both sides, Futian certainly wouldn't react in a presumptuous way either. He replied with a smile. The vice chief and Princess Lingxi both have extraordinary talent. I will gladly learn from them if I have a chance in the future. The domain chief smiled and nodded without saying anything further. For a high-ranking man like him, an indirect suggestion in public was enough to show his high opinion of Futian. There was no doubt that Futian could join the domain chief's manor as the son-in-law, as long as he was keen on the idea himself. In that case, he would be backed by both the domain chief's manor and Four Corner Village. No one in the Shangqing domain would dare to touch him no matter what he did. Zhou Lingxi deliberately approached you in the beginning. I'm afraid that she has some ulterior motive. Xiao Qingyuan talked to Yi Futian through voice transmission. Although Yi Futian couldn't help but chuckle to himself, he knew that Xiao Qingyuan had a point. He carefully thought back on how Zhou Muhuang invited him over, and Zhou Lingxi made advances on him ever since he arrived at the Shangqing continent. The cultivators from the domain chief's manor seemed a little too warm-hearted and generous as well. Yi Futian knew he should be more cautious. Although the domain chief's manor hadn't shown any malicious intent yet, there was nothing wrong with staying vigilant. At the very least, Yi Futian couldn't place too much trust in the domain chief's manor. "Why does the Dark Court want to attack the Void Realm?" someone asked. "The Void Realm was the original realm at first and became an abandoned land later. Nonetheless, it remains to be a special place. Perhaps the Dark Court believes that the original realm still holds a great value," the domain chief replied. "Or maybe neither side wants to turn their own territory into a battlefield, so they picked the original realm." In fact, the domain chief didn't tell the whole truth. He also heard a rumor about a prophecy. The change of the world would originate in the original realm. The prophecy was known by few people and was far from concrete. Nevertheless, as far as the domain chief knew, the prophecy was made by an authoritative figure as his prediction for the future of the world. The original realm was shattered when the heavenly path collapsed. If the change of the world really arose in the original realm again, it must be predestined by divine will. Regardless, the deserted original realm was likely to be the beginning of the new world. It also meant that a major event would probably take place, and even transform the entire world. Of course, the domain chief would never tell this to the public. After all, he had no solid proof, and no one could guarantee what would happen in the future. What he heard was nothing but an elusive prophecy. In the meantime, Yi Futian felt anger rising from within. They chose the original realm as the battlefield because they didn't want to damage their own territories? Why did people living in the original realm deserve to suffer the calamity and ruin of war? Yi Futian grew up in the original realm. His attachment to the original realm was far greater than his feelings for the divine prefecture. While everyone else was engaged in casual conversations, Yi Futian was not in the mood for small talks. He couldn't stop being worried about the situation in the original realm. As soon as he finished the current stage of cultivation, he planned to set out and return to the original realm when the Donghuang Imperial Palace summoned everyone over. "Mr. Yi, is something bothering you?" Zhou Lingxi darted a look at Yi Futian from nearby and asked with a smile. She could tell that Yi Futian was absent-minded. Yi Futian exhaled a long breath to keep his anxiety and distress under control for now. It was meaningless for him to fret about the possibilities. Instead, he should be focusing on improving his strength before he went back to the original realm. He would be able to protect himself better if he managed to advance to the Sixth Order. Otherwise, there was no point for him to go back. He might even become a burden. "Many friends of mine live in the Void Realm. I'm a little worried about them," Yi Futian replied. Zhou Lingxi nodded and said, "We probably will head to the Void Realm in a few days. They will be all right." "Thank you, Princess Lingxi," Yi Futian answered, nodding slightly. Zhou Lingxi gave a slight smile without saying anything else. The banquet went on. The mighty figures were still chatting with each other while the youngsters listening to the conversations intently. The guests didn't split up and leave until the banquet was over. "Mr. Yi, would you like to take a walk in the domain chief's manor?" Zhou Lingxi invited Yi Futian. "There are many unique places in the manor that can be helpful for cultivation." The domain chief's manor was not an ordinary residence. It was as good as a scaled-down city. "Thank you, Princess Lingxi. I would like to return to the Divine Mausoleum to continue my cultivation there. I've been making some progress these days and shouldn't stop halfway," Yi Futian replied. Zhou Lingxi nodded and said, "All right. Still in all, the Divine Casket will remain in the Divine Mausoleum. Mr. Yi, you don't have to rush and risk injury." "I understand." Yi Futian nodded and said, "Princess Lingxi, please excuse me." "Yes," Zhou Lingxi answered. Yi Futian turned around and walked away. Xiao Qingyuan was waiting for him not too far away. She darted a glance at Zhou Lingxi when Yi Futian came over, then left with him, side by side. Zhou Lingxi certainly understood the meaning of Xia Qingyuan's look. However, she still had a faint smile on her beautiful face, which made it impossible to guess what she was thinking. The cultivators from various groups left the domain chief's manor in succession. Nevertheless, many of them seemed to have the same destination. They were all heading to the divine mausoleum. Although the banquet was over, the divine casket was still in the divine mausoleum. These cultivators surely wouldn't miss the precious opportunity. They planned to cultivate next to the divine casket for a while, and would only leave for real if they failed to gain anything from it. Who would be willing to go home without trying their luck at the divine mausoleum first? Even the master cultivators were curious to see how special the sacred remains of Xinjia the Great Emperor truly was. More and more people arrived at the divine mausoleum. The cultivators from the top forces went straight into the mausoleum. Yi Futian and other cultivators from Four Corner Village and the ancient royal family of Duan, including Old Ma, also showed up. Apparently, they planned to cultivate for some days inside the divine mausoleum. The crowd gathered in the divine mausoleum. Plenty of people had settled on the training platform already. Yi Futian and the others stood in the area below and stared ahead. Only a few people were capable of entering the inner zone. Yi Futian was probably the only one outside of the mighty figures. Yi Futian moved forward into the inner zone rather than the training platform overhead. He walked directly in the direction of the divine casket. Other cultivators were not surprised by Yi Futian's move. These top figures of various groups were also eager to see if Yi Futian could really comprehend something with the help of the divine casket. Yi Futian walked to the divine casket and looked right at it. In an instant, the divine light illuminated him, and ancient characters were engraved on his body. A series of deafening noise reverberated through the mausoleum and impelled the crowd to gaze at him with an astonished look. Yi Futian really could cultivate with the aid of the divine casket. How did he withstand the power of the sacred remains? Even the mighty figures were astounded. They stared at Yi Futian and sent out pulses of energy, attempting to gauge his power and figure out his secret cultivation method. However, they failed to sense anything from Yi Futian but a wisp of the energy of the demon god. Was this happening simply because he inherited the will of the demon god? Seeing that Yi Futian had been watching the divine casket continuously for a long time, the cultivators from different groups started to grow anxious and impatient. With a solemn look on their faces and intense energy of the great path surrounding their bodies, they approached the divine casket and looked down from the training platform. The divine casket was situated in the divine mausoleum right now. Why should they wait longer before trying their hands at it too? They might as well go back to where they came from if they didn't have the courage to make an effort. What was the point of staying here? Before long, however, a succession of cultivators started to moan in agony. Many people were bleeding from their eyes, their faces ghastly pale. They pulled back with all possible haste. It was the first attempt for some of them, but some had tried to look at the sacred remains before. After sensing the terrifying power of the divine casket, they began to see Yi Futian in a new light. Why was he able to do it? Old Ma and the others watched everything quietly. Yi Futian was the only one in the divine mausoleum who could successfully study the sacred remains. They wondered if the attention he attracted to himself was a good thing or not. Nevertheless, Yi Futian wasn't bothered by what happened around him. He was absorbed in cultivation and paid no heed to other people's thoughts and opinions. Day after day, Yi Futian was engrossed in cultivation. He sometimes pondered in front of the divine casket and sometimes cultivated on the training platform. The energy of the great path emanated from his body was more and more domineering. Many people suspected that Yi Futian was close to breaking through into the next level. He was using the divine casket to temper his body and work his way up to the sixth order of the Renhuang plane. Other cultivators believed that few Renhuang in the Shangqing domain could defeat Yi Futian after advancing to the sixth order. In the blink of an eye, over a month had passed since the divine mausoleum was built. Some of the master cultivators were still inside the divine mausoleum. They had been cultivating there as well and had made considerable progress. By now, they could more or less comprehend the imperial glory of Xinjia the Great Emperor during his glory days. Of course, Yi Futian undoubtedly remained to be the person who achieved the most thorough comprehension. He was sitting on the training platform at this moment with terrifying sounds of the great path coming out of his body. Nevertheless, he was not looking at the sacred remains, as his eyes were shut tight. He glowed with the dreadful divine light of the great path, and his skin was engraved with countless runes and characters. It seemed that his entire body was engulfed in the divine light emitted by the runes and characters. Over the past few days, the cultivators inside the divine mausoleum had been watching Yi Futian transforming himself little by little. As he achieved more and deeper comprehension through studying the sacred remains, the changes in his body became more apparent as well. Everyone was aware that Yi Futian was on the edge of a major breakthrough. That being said, other cultivators didn't know that the scenes in Yi Futian's life palace were even more gruesome. At this point, Yi Futian had entered a mysterious world where his consciousness had materialized. A man of great height and powerful build towered over him. It was Xinjiao the Great Emperor who seemed to be raised from the dead, now standing in front of him. They confronted each other face to face. Yi Futian felt like he was facing not a human cultivator but a god and his path. He found laws and orders of the path of Xinjiao the Great Emperor. To put it more accurately, he had identified him as Xinjiao the Great Emperor himself. He was Xinjiao the Great Emperor, the man who challenged the heavenly path and proclaimed that there had been no path in the world until he came forth. Bang! Yi Futian's body almost turned into a melting pot for the great path. Various types of energy of the great path emanated from his body as the deafening noise inside him blasted continuously and relentlessly. All the cultivators in the divine mausoleum could feel the fierce power of the great path rushing out of Yi Futian. This is... Many people couldn't help but turn around to look in Yi Futian's direction, including some in the middle of a cultivation session. They all sensed the formidable force coming out of Yi Futian's body. Yi Futian studied the sacred remains in the divine casket, and cultivating the great path with its help. Was he going to advance to the next level, finally? This possibility disheartened most of the genius cultivators from top forces. They hadn't achieved anything while Yi Futian was ready to move up to a higher cultivation level already. Yi Futian easily put everyone else in the shade when it came to cultivating with the help of the sacred remains in the divine casket. However, instead of trying for the higher level, Yi Futian was actually caught in a remarkable state of mind at this moment. He had abundant experience with obtaining several distinctly different skills through cultivation and comprehension. The most frequently used cultivation method in the later stage was the deed of thorough comprehension. The deed of thorough comprehension could be cultivated in both the standard and the reverse order. Back in the days, the Sky River Great Elder cultivated the deed of thorough comprehension in reverse order. Although he achieved a major breakthrough and reached the level of fake emperors, he was also demonized by the process. To cultivate the deed of thorough comprehension in the standard order meant to absorb the power of everything in the world into one's body to build up and strengthen oneself. On the contrary, the Sky River Great Elder cultivated the deed of thorough comprehension in reverse order, and surrendered his own path to the world. He offered himself up as a sacrifice, and never achieved true spiritual transcendence. Despite that, either way of cultivating the deed of thorough comprehension was beneath Xinjiao the Great Emperor, and was never on an equal footing with his own cultivation method. Xinjiao the Great Emperor only cultivated himself. He rose above the path and established the world by himself. His own body was his path. Not a single person after him ever had the same level of vision and boldness. Yi Futian could almost perceive the ego and pride of Xinjiao the Great Emperor from his remains. He became aware of his cultivation method and his ambition to reign over the path. Perhaps this was where the ultimate cultivation led to? Did all the great emperors pursue the same goal? Yi Futian had no way of knowing. At least now, he could make out the cultivation path of Xinjiao the Great Emperor. Moreover, the feeling became stronger and stronger, and subconsciously he followed the same path. As he continued to cultivate in such a way, Yi Futian entered a marvelous state where he was mesmerized by Xinjiao the Great Emperor and his cultivation path. The forceful great path kept tempering his body, and the deafening noise attracted more attention. Everyone was wondering what was coming Yi Futian's way. Not only did the spectators not know, but Futian also couldn't tell. Cultivating through comprehension was a magical experience. Sometimes the cultivator would get lost in a hypnotized state. Right now, Futian was sent into such a trance where he completely relaxed. His consciousness floated in an illusory world. He saw himself everywhere. It was as though the entire world was filled with his consciousness. The divine light of the great path kept radiating from his body. Futian started to let this burst of power run free. Futian even forgot about time and couldn't extricate himself from cultivation. His body. The onlookers around noticed the astonishing changes in Futian's body. They stared at Futian and sensed the extremely powerful energy of the great path emerging from him. Could it be that he really used the sacred remains in the divine casket to comprehend the great path, and even tempered his own body with it? Some mighty figures were intently watching Futian's cultivation process as well. Maybe he picked the right way. A voice rang out. It was the clan leader of the Nahai family speaking to Lan, Nahai Qianxue, and other people behind him. The clan leader also comprehended a little from studying the sacred remains, but he hadn't applied it to cultivation yet. He realized that Futian had taken one step further than all the master cultivators, himself included. He suspected that Futian might have selected the correct cultivation path, and was elevating himself with the help of his comprehension. As time went on, everyone felt that Futian was making progress and growing stronger every second. But no one knew for sure how powerful he became. Futian's efforts even made the stone wall behind him vibrate violently. The loud booms echoed through the divine mausoleum. Surprisingly, he floated forward and descended from the training platform. Everyone's gaze was fixed on Futian, who was approaching the divine casket from above. Futian's eyes were still closed shut, staying afloat right above the divine casket. In between the stone pillars, he came face to face with the sacred remains. Bang! The crowd was dazzled by the terrifying divine light and heard the deafening noise coming out of Futian's body. They even sensed that the energy was flowing out of the divine casket as well. All the mighty figures gaped at the divine casket at this moment. They saw that Xinjiao, the great emperor's body, was moving inside the casket. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.